Grandpa Harrison stopped mid-bite, his silver fork clinking sharply against the fine china. Wait a minute. You are paying your own parents' rent to live in that townhouse? The entire dining room went dead silent. Before I could answer, my father waved his hand dismissively, claiming my younger sister and her husband needed the charity more than I did. Then my brother-in-law actually smirked and told me to pitch in an extra $500 a month to fund his fake lifestyle. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I just looked at Grandpa, whose eyes narrowed into a cold, calculating stare that meant someone was about to lose everything. My name is Madison. I am 34 years old, working as a cybersecurity architect, and until that Thanksgiving dinner, I thought I was just the overlooked middle child. What my toxic family did not know was that I secretly made $350,000 a year, and I was about to use every ounce of my professional skills to dismantle their entire fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to sit back and watch entitled family members dig their own graves. The dining room in my parents' heavily mortgaged suburban home was a masterclass in pretending to be rich. My mother, Patricia, who was 60 years old but fought fiercely to look 40, had decorated the table with imported crystal and massive floral centerpieces. She sat at the foot of the table, dripping in designer logos and flashing a diamond tennis bracelet I strongly suspected was purchased on a high-interest credit card. My father, Richard, was 62 and wore a tailored suit just to carve the turkey in his own home. They had always been obsessed with appearances, but their true masterpiece was my younger sister, Brittany. At 31, Brittany was a stay-at-home mommy vlogger who treated life like an endless photo shoot. Sitting beside her was her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 33-year-old African-American man who loved introducing himself as a tech entrepreneur. He wore a velvet blazer to dinner and loved dropping Silicon Valley buzzwords despite the fact that his startup had never produced a single line of code, let alone a profit. And then there was me. I sat quietly near the middle of the table, wearing a plain, unbranded beige cashmere sweater and simple trousers. To them, I was just Madison, the boring IT worker who fixed computers and lacked the glamorous ambition required to be a true member of this family. They treated my career as a tedious hobby, completely unaware that my role as a cybersecurity architect for a global financial firm came with a base salary of $350,000 a year. I liked keeping my wealth invisible. It kept the leeches at bay, or so I thought. The guest of honor that evening was my Grandpa Harrison. At 82 years old, he was a self-made logistics billionaire who had built a shipping empire from a single delivery truck. Unlike my parents, Grandpa Harrison hated flashy displays of wealth. He wore practical button-down shirts, drove a 10-year-old truck, and possessed a razor-sharp mind that missed absolutely nothing. He was the only person in the family who had ever shown me genuine warmth, likely because we shared the same quiet, analytical nature. Dinner was proceeding with the usual suffocating tension. Brittany was complaining loudly about the exhausting demands of managing her social media presence and raising 3 children. Jamal was swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, boasting about a phantom group of angel investors who were supposedly begging to fund his latest app idea. My parents nodded along in rapt admiration, hanging on to their every word, as if Jamal were the next Steve Jobs. Then Grandpa Harrison turned his attention to me. He smiled warmly, cutting through the noise of Jamal's endless bragging. "So, Madison, how are you liking that townhouse? It is a great neighborhood. You getting settled in all right?" I smiled back, happy to engage with the only rational person at the table. "It is wonderful, Grandpa. The location is perfect for my commute. The $4,500 a month rent is a bit steep for the area, but the space is exactly what I need." The effect of my words was instantaneous and absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. Brittany froze with her wineglass halfway to her mouth. Patricia sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes darting nervously toward the head of the table. Grandpa Harrison stopped mid-bite. His thick white eyebrows drew together in deep confusion. "Wait a minute. You are paying your own parents' rent to live in that townhouse?" The air in the room suddenly felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Before I could even process the strange reaction, my father jumped in, his voice unnaturally loud, and rushed. Dad, it is just practical economics. Madison is a single woman with a steady paycheck. She needs to learn financial responsibility. Besides, Brittany and Jamal have 3 growing kids. They need the space of the big house more than she does. I stared at my father, trying to untangle the sudden shift in the conversation. The big house he referred to was the $1.5 million mansion my parents had somehow secured for Brittany and Jamal to live in completely rent-free. Patricia immediately chimed in, her tone dripping with that familiar condescending sweetness she used whenever she was gaslighting me. Exactly, Richard. Madison, you know perfectly well that your sister has a family to think about. Jamal is in the crucial stages of building his tech empire. They need the mansion to host potential investors and maintain a proper environment for the children. You work in a cubicle all day. You should be grateful we let you rent the townhouse at all instead of putting it on the open market. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. My parents were openly admitting that they were charging me an exorbitant amount of rent to essentially subsidize the lavish rent-free lifestyle of my sister and her husband. I was funding their golden child while being treated like a financial burden. But it was Jamal who pushed the situation from deeply unfair to completely unforgivable. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, entitled grin spreading across his face as he swirled his bourbon. He looked at me with an expression of pure arrogance. Come on, Madison. You work in IT. You make a decent living fixing networks or whatever it is you do. In fact, the kids' private school tuition just went up again this semester. You should probably pitch in an extra $500 a month on top of your rent. Family supports family, right? You do not have anyone else to spend it on anyway. The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air. He was sitting in a multi-million-dollar home. He did not pay for drinking liquor. He did not buy asking his sister-in-law to increase her rent to pay for his children's private education while he played businessman. My mother nodded enthusiastically. Jamal is absolutely right. It takes a village, Madison. You should be proud to contribute to your nieces' and nephews' futures instead of hoarding your paycheck. Any other person might have yelled. Any other daughter might have broken down in tears at the blatant cruelty and blatant favoritism being displayed by her own parents. But my professional life is spent identifying threats, analyzing malicious code, and neutralizing attacks without emotion. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself. I simply closed my mouth, folded my hands in my lap, and looked directly at Grandpa Harrison. Grandpa did not yell either. He did not slam his fist on the table or launch into a lecture. He simply looked at Richard, then at Patricia, and finally at Jamal. His eyes, usually warm and bright, narrowed into a dead, calculating stare. It was the look of a man who had navigated cutthroat business deals for 50 years. A man who had just realized his own son was running a scam. The silence stretched on, suffocating and heavy, and in that quiet moment, I knew the game had irrevocably changed. The rest of the meal passed in a suffocating silence. Grandpa Harrison did not say another word. He finished his turkey with slow, deliberate precision, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and announced he was retiring to his hotel early. My father rushed to offer him a ride, stammering apologies for the abrupt end to the evening, but Grandpa simply held up a hand, ordered his own car service, and left without offering his usual holiday farewells. The moment the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind him, the fragile illusion of family harmony shattered completely. I gathered a stack of dirty plates and carried them into the massive gourmet kitchen. It was a spectacular room, featuring marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that my mother rarely used for actual cooking. I had barely set the dishes down by the sink when Patricia stormed into the room, her heels clicking aggressively against the imported tile. She cornered me between the center island and the refrigerator, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and fury. What exactly was the point of that little display? She hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. Her diamond bracelets clinked against the marble as she slammed her hands down on the counter. Why did you have to mention the exact amount? You know your grandfather is strict about money. You deliberately tried to make your father and me look bad in front of the only man who holds the purse strings. I kept my face perfectly neutral, focusing my eyes on the intricate pattern of the marble, rather than engaging with her hostility. My silence only fueled her anger. Do not stand there ignoring me, Madison. You know exactly what you did. You are just jealous because Brittany is giving us grandchildren while you stare at computer screens all day. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, her expensive perfume suddenly suffocating. We charge you rent to teach you fiscal responsibility. You have no dependents, no husband, and no real obligations. We are doing you a favor by letting you stay in a property we manage, and instead of being grateful, you try to sabotage your sister's livelihood. Jamal is working tirelessly to secure venture capital for an app that will change the world. It takes resources to support a genius, something a simple IT worker like you could never comprehend. Before my mother could continue her tirade, the kitchen door swung open. Brittany strolled in, holding her smartphone attached to a specialized stabilizer grip. The bright ring light illuminated her perfectly contoured face. She was speaking directly into the camera, broadcasting her manufactured reality to thousands of strangers on the internet. "Hey guys," she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Just doing a little post-Thanksgiving debrief. We had a gorgeous dinner, but dealing with some toxic family dynamics right now." She angled the camera slightly, keeping me out of the frame, but making sure her followers knew exactly who she was talking about. "My sister is bringing all this negative energy into the kitchen and completely ruining my holiday aesthetic. It is just so draining, you know." Brittany leaned against the doorway, flipping her long hair over her shoulder and sighing dramatically into the microphone. "People who do not have children just do not understand the immense sacrifice required to be a mother. I am raising 3 beautiful kids, managing a household, and supporting a tech visionary husband. It is a 24-hour-a-day job." She pouted at her own reflection on the screen. "It is honestly so selfish when single people hoard their paychecks and refuse to help their own flesh and blood. Family is supposed to be about building a legacy together, not keeping every penny for yourself while your nieces and nephews need things. I mean, how hard is it to just be supportive? Some people are so bitter that they do not have their own ring on their finger, so they try to ruin the holidays for those of us who are actually building generational wealth." Jamal drifted into the kitchen right behind her, holding his empty crystal glass. He walked straight past me, opened the custom wine fridge, and poured himself a generous measure of my father's most expensive reserve. He draped a casual arm around Brittany's waist, leaning his chin on her shoulder to look into her camera. "Do not let the haters get you down, babe," he murmured smoothly, presenting his best supportive husband angle for the vlog. "Some people just lack the vision to see the bigger picture. We are building an empire, and empires require investment." He took a sip of the amber liquid, shot me a condescending wink over the rim of the glass, and guided my sister back out into the living room, leaving me alone with Patricia. Throughout the entire bizarre performance, I did not utter a single syllable. I stood perfectly still, breathing evenly, analyzing their behavior with the same clinical detachment I used when dissecting a malicious cyber attack. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that reacting emotionally to a threat only gives the attacker leverage. Silence is a firewall. By refusing to argue, I denied them the emotional validation they desperately craved. I watched Patricia's face carefully. Underneath her aggressive posturing, I could read the raw, frantic panic in her eyes. She was terrified. Grandpa Harrison controlled the primary family trusts, and if he suspected financial mismanagement, he could cut off their access to the lifestyle they could not actually afford. My mother crossed her arms, her manicured nails digging into her silk sleeves. "You need to fix this," she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are going to call your grandfather tomorrow. You are going to tell him that you misspoke, that you were confused about your finances, and that you gladly pay that rent because you want to help your sister's family. You will tell him Jamal's company is on the verge of a major breakthrough. If you ruin your father's relationship with Harrison, I swear to you, Madison, you will regret it." I simply picked up a dish towel, wiped down the sink, and walked past her without breaking my stride. I did not nod. I did not promise to fix anything. I just let her words echo off the expensive tile, leaving her alone with her own mounting paranoia. The drive back to my townhouse was quiet and dark. The crisp November air filtering through the car vents felt incredibly cleansing after the toxic atmosphere of my parents' house. My hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, my mind rapidly processing the data points I had just collected. They were not just entitled, they were desperate. Jamal's blatant demand for an extra $500 a month, Patricia's unhinged defense of charging me exorbitant rent, and their shared panic over Grandpa Harrison's reaction all pointed to a significant financial vulnerability. People with real wealth do not beg their single sister for private school tuition money. People running successful tech companies do not need to squeeze their relatives for rent subsidies. They thought they had me cornered. They thought their coordinated gaslighting and emotional manipulation would force me back into submission, just as it had when I was a teenager. They expected me to internalize the guilt, to accept the label of the selfish, jealous sister, and to open my wallet to buy back their conditional affection. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the woman I had become. They thought I was just a quiet, boring girl staring at screens. They had absolutely no idea that those screens had taught me how to trace every digital footprint, uncover every hidden asset, and dismantle entire networks line by line. I parked my car in the driveway of the townhouse I was supposedly renting from them. I looked up at the brick facade, a strange new suspicion taking root in my mind. I let them dig their own graves tonight. Now it was time to find out exactly what they were trying to bury. 3 days passed in absolute silence. There were no passive-aggressive text messages from Patricia. There were no indirect social media posts from Brittany complaining about ungrateful siblings. There were no phone calls from my father trying to smooth things over. The silence was not an apology. It was a calculated psychological tactic. In my family, the silent treatment was always the precursor to a major demand. They were waiting for me to crack, waiting for the anxiety of being isolated from the family unit to force me into submission. They expected me to reach out first, begging for forgiveness for my behavior at Thanksgiving dinner. I did not reach out. I spent the weekend in my home office surrounded by 4 large monitors, sipping black coffee and running threat simulations for my corporate clients. My home office was my sanctuary, a climate-controlled room filled with high-end processing units and secure servers. It was a space built on logic, binary code, and undeniable facts, everything my family abhorred. On Tuesday morning, right as I was finishing a security patch, a notification chimed on my primary monitor. An email had just arrived in my personal inbox. It was not a message checking on my well-being. It was an automated notification from a digital signature platform. The sender was Richard. My own father had sent me a formal legal document. I clicked the secure link and opened the file. The header read, Residential Lease Renewal Agreement. I scrolled down past the standard legal jargon, my eyes scanning for the key variables. I found them on page 2. The new monthly rent was set at $5,500. The term of the lease was locked in for 36 months. There was an aggressive early termination clause that would penalize me the full remaining balance if I tried to move out before the 3 years were up. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and analyzed the sheer audacity of the document. They were demanding a $1,000 monthly increase effective immediately. They wanted me legally bound to pay them $198,000 over the next 3 years. This was not a simple rent adjustment. This was a shakedown. Grandpa Harrison must have made good on whatever silent threat his eyes had promised at the Thanksgiving table. My parents were bleeding cash, and they were trying to use me as a tourniquet. My phone buzzed on the desk beside my keyboard. The screen lit up with a text message from Jamal. I unlocked the device and read the paragraph he had just sent. Sign the lease, Madison. Grandpa is threatening to cut off Richard's allowance because you opened your mouth at dinner. If you do not sign it today, I will tell the whole family how you are letting your own nieces starve just to prove a point. Do not be a bitter spinster. We need this. I read the text a second time, letting the sheer absurdity of his words wash over me. Jamal, the self-proclaimed tech visionary who wore velvet tuxedo jackets to family dinners, was begging his sister-in-law for rent money. His text was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. First came the admission of panic. Grandpa Harrison was indeed cutting off my father's allowance, proving that Richard's entire wealthy persona was funded by his elderly parent. Second came the guilt trip, equating my refusal to be extorted with starving my nieces, completely ignoring the fact that Jamal and Brittany lived in a $1.5 million mansion with a luxury SUV in the driveway. Finally came the personal attack. Calling me a bitter spinster was a desperate attempt to trigger my insecurities, to make me feel so undesirable and alone that I would pay $5,500 a month just to remain in their good graces. In the cybersecurity field, we deal with social engineering attacks every single day. When threat actors send phishing emails or ransomware demands, they always rely on creating a sense of extreme urgency. They use fear guilt, or the threat of public embarrassment, to force the victim into making a quick emotional decision before they have time to think critically. Jamal and my parents were running a textbook social engineering scam on me. They wanted me panicked. They wanted me compliant. Instead of feeling hurt, I felt a deep, chilling sense of focus. I placed my phone face down on the polished wood of my desk. I did not type back a furious response defending my character. I did not call my mother to argue about the rent increase. Emotional responses are exactly what manipulators use to drain your energy and blind you to the truth. I looked around the room. I looked at the hardwood floors, the crown molding lining the ceiling, the custom-built windows overlooking the street. I had lived in this townhouse for exactly 60 months. I had paid $4,500 on the first of every single month without fail. That was $270,000 I had handed over to my parents. They had always told me they bought this place as an investment property and were doing me a massive favor by letting family rent it instead of putting it on the open market. They used that narrative to shut down any questions I had about the lease terms or the lack of formal maintenance. But desperate people make mistakes. Jamal's panicked text message had just confirmed that my parents' finances were entirely dependent on Grandpa Harrison's goodwill and my monthly rent checks. If Richard was relying on an allowance from his father to stay afloat, how exactly did he afford to purchase a luxury townhouse in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city? The math did not align. The timeline was completely flawed. Scammers always leave a digital trail. People can lie, scream, gaslight, and manipulate, but financial records are entirely immune to emotions. I turned back to my monitors. I closed my work applications and opened a secure encrypted browser. I routed my connection through a private virtual network. The time for being the quiet, accommodating middle child was over. If they wanted to treat my housing like a cutthroat business transaction, I was going to audit the entire operation. It was time to follow the digital trail. I pulled up the state government portal and navigated to the county clerk's public property tax database. I typed in my own address and hit enter. The screen flickered. The public portal for property records is usually a labyrinth of outdated interfaces, but my corporate network easily bypasses standard traffic throttles. The parcel record populated my left monitor. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning past the zoning codes and lot dimensions, searching for the current ownership details. For 5 years, my parents had spun a very specific narrative about this property. Richard sat in my apartment half a decade ago, wearing a tailored suit, and offered me this townhouse. He claimed he and Patricia had purchased it as a long-term investment. He told me the market rate was $6,000, but because I was family, they would let me live there for $4,500. I had then wired that exact amount to an account named Harrison Property Management on the first of every month. I truly believed I was helping them build their retirement portfolio while securing a safe place to live. I scrolled down to the recorded deed history. My eyes locked onto the field designated for the legal property owner. The names Richard and Patricia were absent. There was no limited liability company. There was no corporate management firm. The owner was listed simply as a blind trust. A blind trust is a financial vehicle designed specifically to conceal the identity of the true owner and the beneficiaries. Wealthy individuals use them to purchase real estate anonymously. My parents were not wealthy. They were buried in high-interest debt, desperately leveraging one credit card to pay off another just to maintain their country club facade. They did not have the capital to fund a blind trust, nor the sophisticated financial literacy to set one up. This required serious corporate lawyers. This required Grandpa Harrison. I needed to see the unredacted documents. The public-facing website only offered a summary hiding the actual scanned files of the deed transfer behind a paywall meant for licensed real estate attorneys. In my line of work, accessing gated information is not an obstacle. It is just a puzzle waiting to be solved. I opened a command line interface on my second monitor and ran a custom script I had developed for auditing vendor networks. I queried a specialized open-source intelligence database, cross-referencing the parcel identification number with municipal tax receipts. The data started rolling in lines of green text spilling down the black screen. I tracked the property tax payments for the last 5 years. They were not paid by Richard or Patricia. The taxes were paid annually in a single lump sum from a corporate escrow account linked to Grandpa Harrison's primary logistics firm. My parents had never paid a single dime toward the maintenance or taxes of this townhouse. I bypassed the county paywall using a secure proxy and downloaded the original 80-page closing document from 5 years ago. I opened the file on my central monitor, maximizing the screen resolution. I scrolled through the standard title insurance forms, the environmental surveys, and the municipal disclosures. I reached the final page, the warranty deed that legally transferred the property from the developer to the current owner. The legal name of the entity holding the deed was not a generic blind trust. It was explicitly printed in bold black ink, the Madison Harrison Revocable Trust. I stopped breathing. The air in my home office suddenly felt completely still. I read the name again, tracing the letters with my eyes. The Madison Harrison Revocable Trust. The house did not belong to my parents. The house belonged to a trust entirely in my name. Grandpa Harrison had not just helped my parents out. He had bought this townhouse outright in cash and placed it in a trust specifically designated for me. I was the beneficiary. I was the absolute owner. But if I was the owner, how had my parents managed to extort rent from me for half a decade? I scrolled further down the document to the signature lines. The answer stared back at me, exposing the full depth of their depravity. Under the section designating the trustees, the individuals legally appointed to manage the trust, until I reached a certain age or milestone, were 2 signatures, Richard and Patricia. Grandpa Harrison must have established this trust 5 years ago, likely intending it to be a secure asset for my future. He appointed my parents as the trustees, trusting his own son to manage the property responsibly on my behalf. Instead of informing me about my grandfather's incredible gift, my parents hid the documents. They approached me playing the role of generous landlords. They fabricated a fake lease agreement. They forced me to pay $4,500 every month to live in a house I already owned. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up my banking history. I filtered my outgoing wire transfers for the last 60 months. $270,000. That was the exact amount of money my parents had siphoned from my bank account. They had hijacked a gift meant to secure my future and transformed it into a personal cash machine to fund their own delusions of grandeur. They used my stolen money to lease luxury cars. They used it to buy designer handbags. And most sickening of all, they used my money to subsidize the $1.5 million mansion where Brittany and Jamal currently lived rent-free. I did not scream. I did not throw things across the room or dissolve into a puddle of tears. The betrayal was so massive, so meticulously calculated, that it transcended ordinary anger. It was a violation of the most fundamental trust a child should have in their parents. They had looked me in the eye every single month for 5 years, accepted my money, and then had the sheer audacity to call me selfish for not pitching in more. I saved the trust documents to an offline drive. The investigation had begun. The offline drive blinked with a steady green light, securing the PDF files that completely rewrote my entire adult life. I sat in the glow of my monitors and stared at the digital calculator on my screen. $4,500 multiplied by 60 months. $270,000. The number was massive, glaring, and utterly devastating. I had transferred over $250,000 of my hard-earned money directly into the pockets of the people who were supposed to protect me. My chest tightened not with sorrow, but with a cold, absolute fury that began to crystallize in my veins. I looked around my home office, tracing the lines of the expensive equipment I had purchased to further my career. I thought about the 60-hour work weeks, the missed vacations, and the sheer exhaustion I had endured to secure my position as a cybersecurity architect. I had justified my grueling schedule by telling myself I was building a solid financial foundation. I had lived frugally, wearing simple clothes, and driving a practical car, entirely because I believed a large portion of my income was tied up in securing this roof over my head. All that time, my parents were bleeding me dry. They had watched me work myself to the bone and smiled while cashing my checks. I turned back to the keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys with lethal precision. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of their fraud. Grandpa Harrison was a brilliant businessman, meaning he would never just hand over a valuable asset without legal safeguards. I pulled up the trust bylaws I had managed to decrypt from the county clerk archives. The stipulations were crystal clear. The trust was established for my sole benefit. Richard and Patricia were appointed as trustees, strictly to manage the property maintenance and pay the annual taxes using funds Grandpa Harrison had separately allocated. The document explicitly prohibited the trustees from charging the beneficiary rent or profiting from the estate in any capacity. My parents had completely bypassed the legal parameters of the trust. They had fabricated the lease agreement they forced me to sign 5 years ago. I opened my personal files and retrieved the digital copy of that original lease. I scrutinized the document with new eyes. The letterhead read, Harrison Property Management, a company that I now realized did not legally exist. It was a phantom entity, a cheap facade constructed in a word processor to look official. They had forged their authority, playing the role of benevolent landlords while violating federal law. I needed to follow the actual cash flow. In cybersecurity, finding the breach is only half the battle. Tracing the exfiltrated data is where you find the true extent of the damage. I opened my banking portal and exported the routing data for every single wire transfer I had made on the first of the month for the past 5 years. I ran the destination routing number through a financial registry database. The results confirmed my darkest suspicions. The money had never gone into an escrow account. It had never gone into the trust. The routing number belonged to a standard joint checking account at a local credit union. The account holders were Richard and Patricia. I opened a new window and pulled up Brittany's public social media profiles. I spent 30 minutes scrolling through her perfectly curated vlog posts and glamorous photos. Every image was a testament to my stolen money. There was Brittany posing with a new limited edition designer handbag that cost more than a used car. There was Jamal showing off a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo for a charity gala. There were photos of their 3 children attending an exclusive private academy where the tuition rivaled college expenses. I watched a video of Jamal standing in his driveway leaning against a brand new luxury SUV, talking to his followers about the hustle required to be a successful tech entrepreneur. He spoke about grinding for venture capital and building a legacy. He was funding his entire illusion of grandeur with my cybersecurity salary. My parents were literally funneling my rent checks directly into Brittany and Jamal's bank accounts to keep their golden child living in absolute luxury. They had weaponized my sense of responsibility. They knew I valued independence and would never miss a payment. They leveraged my quiet nature, confident I would never complain or look too closely at the paperwork. They treated me like a compliant ATM dispensing cash to sustain their fake high society image. And then, when their greed outpaced my monthly payments, they had the nerve to demand an extra $500 and call me selfish for hesitating. A normal person might have grabbed their phone and called their parents screaming. A normal person might have confronted their sister demanding their money back and threatening to call the police. But I was not a normal person. I was a network security expert who understood that alerting a threat actor to their exposure gives them time to destroy evidence and cover their tracks. I did not call my father. I did not text my mother. I certainly did not reply to Jamal's manipulative demands. I remained perfectly silent in the digital shadows. Instead, I opened a secure cloud server hosted on an encrypted offshore network. I began meticulously screenshotting every single document, every bank transfer, every fake lease agreement, and every property tax record. I categorized the files, cross-referenced the dates, and built a comprehensive, undeniable portfolio of their felony fraud. I captured Brittany's social media posts matching the dates of her luxury purchases with the exact days my rent checks cleared my parents' account. I archived everything in triplicate, ensuring that even if they somehow gained physical access to my hardware, the evidence would survive. My transition from victim to predator was complete. The initial shock had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a pristine, calculated determination. My family had viewed my silence as weakness. They had mistaken my introversion for ignorance. They were about to learn that the quietest person in the room is usually the one holding all the keys. I closed my terminal and looked at the blinking cursor on my screen. I had the receipts. I had the proof of their massive financial crime. Now I needed to secure my perimeter and prepare for total war. The blinking cursor felt like a metronome ticking down the seconds until my next move. In the realm of cybersecurity, discovering a breach is only phase 1. Phase 2 is containment. You assume the threat actor has compromised everything. If my parents possessed the audacity to forge a federal trust document and masquerade as property managers to extort $250,000 from their own daughter, their ethical boundaries simply did not exist. I had to assume they had compromised my entire identity. They had my social security number. They knew my date of birth. They had access to my mother's maiden name, the answer to half the security questions on the internet. I was a walking, talking vulnerability waiting to be exploited further. I opened a secure dashboard linking directly to the 3 major credit bureaus. My fingers moved with practiced speed as I initiated a comprehensive forensic sweep of my credit history. I pulled the data from Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion simultaneously. I scanned the green text populating my monitor, looking for any anomalous activity. I checked for unauthorized credit cards opened in my name. I searched for personal loans or secondary mortgages that Richard might have attempted to secure using my clean financial record. Thankfully, the lines of data came back clean. My credit score remained a pristine 810, untouched by their greedy hands. They had been satisfied milking me for rent, unaware of the massive salary I was actually pulling in. But I was not about to leave the door unlocked. I executed a hard freeze across all 3 bureaus. From this moment forward, no one could open a line of credit, take out a loan, or run a background check using my identity without a highly encrypted multi-factor authentication PIN that lived exclusively on a physical security token locked in my desk drawer. My digital identity was now a fortress. But digital borders were not enough. I needed to safeguard my physical assets. I turned my attention to the substantial wealth I had quietly accumulated over the past decade. My annual compensation package of $350,000 had allowed me to build a massive liquid savings portfolio. I had millions sitting in domestic brokerage accounts and high-yield savings. If my parents somehow discovered my actual net worth during their impending panic, they would undoubtedly try to lay claim to it, perhaps attempting to sue me for parental support or fabricating some other legal nightmare. I initiated a series of complex wire transfers. I bypassed standard retail banking interfaces and used a secure institutional portal I maintained for high-level asset management. I routed my primary liquid funds out of the domestic banking system entirely. I moved the capital through a series of encrypted channels, eventually depositing the bulk of my wealth into a secure, heavily protected offshore account situated in a jurisdiction known for impenetrable financial privacy laws. The transactions cleared within minutes. My money vanished from the visible grid. To anyone looking at my standard checking account, I appeared to be a moderately successful IT worker living paycheck to paycheck. I was officially untouchable. Next, I fortified my physical environment. My parents had always retained an emergency access code to the smart locks on my townhouse doors. They claimed it was a necessary precaution in case of a fire or medical crisis. In reality, it was a leash. I opened the home security application on my phone. I wiped their access credentials from the system database. I changed the master code. I reset the encryption keys on my exterior cameras, ensuring they could no longer pull up the video feeds to check if my car was in the driveway. I severed their physical access to my home with the tap of a button. The townhouse, the property my grandfather had bought specifically for me, was finally truly mine. With my perimeter secured, it was time to address the active threat still lingering on my phone screen. Jamal's extortion attempt was still sitting in my inbox, demanding that I sign a fraudulent lease agreement for $5,500 a month. He and my parents were waiting for a reaction. They expected me to cave under the pressure of their coordinated psychological attack. They wanted me to beg to negotiate, to apologize for breathing wrong at the Thanksgiving table. I picked up my smartphone. The glass felt cool against my palm. I stared at the aggressive, manipulative paragraph Jamal had sent, threatening to label me a bitter spinster who starved her own nieces. I did not feel an ounce of anger. I felt the absolute chilling clarity of a predator watching its prey walk directly into a snare. In a corporate cyber attack, if you let the hackers know you have detected their presence, they immediately burn the servers and destroy the evidence. You have to play along. You have to let them think their malware is working perfectly, while you silently build the trap that will ultimately destroy them. I opened the message thread. I kept my expression perfectly smooth. I tapped the keyboard with steady, unhurried precision, typing out a response designed to feed their massive, fragile egos. You are right. Family is everything. I will take care of the paperwork. I hit send. The message flew through the cellular network and landed on Jamal's screen. I could picture him standing in the kitchen of that $1.5 million mansion, showing the text to Brittany and my parents. I could imagine the smug, victorious smiles spreading across their faces. I could almost hear Patricia praising her own brilliant manipulation tactics, convinced that she had successfully broken her difficult middle daughter once again. They would be celebrating their victory, completely oblivious to the reality that they had just sealed their own spectacular downfall. I set the phone back down on the desk. The digital signature document containing the fraudulent lease renewal was still sitting in my inbox, waiting to be executed. I would sign it. I would let them countersign it. I would hand them the exact rope they needed to hang themselves in a federal court. I turned off my monitors, the screens fading to black, leaving my home office in total darkness. The perimeter was locked down, the bait was set, the war had officially begun. The next morning, I bypassed my usual corporate commute and drove straight into the heart of the financial district. I navigated my car into the underground parking garage of a sleek, glass-fronted skyscraper, completely ignoring the chaotic barrage of unread messages from my family. I took the private keycard access elevator up to the 42nd floor. My destination was the law firm of Nathaniel Pierce. Nathaniel was not a standard run-of-the-mill family lawyer who handled petty domestic disputes. He was a high-stakes estate litigator who specialized in dismantling fraudulent trusts, prosecuting fiduciary breaches, and recovering stolen assets for high-net-worth individuals. He charged $1,000 an hour, a premium fee I gladly paid up front, using untraceable funds from my offshore accounts. I walked into his expansive corner office, which offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the city skyline. Nathaniel sat behind a massive glass desk, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, radiating the exact kind of ruthless clinical competence I required for this operation. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional breakdowns. I unzipped my designer briefcase, pulled out my encrypted flash drive, and placed it precisely in the center of his spotless desk. "Everything you need is on that drive," I said, taking the leather chair opposite him and crossing my legs. My parents have been acting as fraudulent trustees for a blind trust established by my grandfather 5 years ago. They fabricated a fake lease agreement and successfully extorted $270,000 in rent from me for a property I legally own. I signed a new, heavily inflated lease yesterday solely to secure their digital signatures, providing you with irrefutable proof of them committing federal wire fraud. Nathaniel did not blink. He simply plugged the drive into his secure terminal. His eyes scanned the documents with predatory focus, clicking rapidly through the files I had organized. He read the original trust bylaws, compared them to the fake lease agreements, and examined the wire transfer routing numbers I had extracted from my banking portal. "Your documentation is flawless, Madison," Nathaniel stated, his tone carrying a note of deep professional respect. "This is a clear-cut case of fiduciary breach and felony fraud. You have handed me a loaded gun. But there is a secondary issue here, one that requires immediate aggressive intervention." He quickly typed a sequence of commands into his keyboard, pulling up a specialized municipal database reserved for licensed real estate attorneys. "I always run a preliminary title sweep on any property involved in an active trust dispute. I ran yours 30 minutes before you arrived to ensure we had a clear battlefield." Nathaniel turned his large monitor toward me. "Your parents are not just siphoning your liquid cash through fake rent payments. They are actively attempting to liquidate the equity of the asset itself." I stared at the screen, my eyes scanning the highlighted row of text. It was a pending financial encumbrance. My parents, acting under their fraudulent authority as trustees, had submitted a formal application to take out a $500,000 home equity line of credit against my townhouse. Because they were still legally listed as the managing trustees on the county records, they possessed the superficial authority to leverage the property, provided the commercial lender did not look too closely at the underlying trust stipulations prohibiting such actions. "What is the stated purpose of the loan?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Nathaniel pointed to a specific line on the digitized bank application. "Seed funding and capital investment for a technology startup." Jamal. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening, crystal-clear logic. Jamal's velvet tuxedo at Thanksgiving, the relentless bragging about phantom angel investors, the sheer panic over Grandpa Harrison cutting off my father's allowance. They were completely broke. The $1.5 million mansion my parents had secured for Brittany and Jamal was draining their accounts dry. Jamal's fake tech empire was generating zero revenue. To keep the illusion of generational wealth alive, my father was trying to take out a $500,000 loan against my house to hand the cash directly to his golden child's husband. If that loan went through and Jamal inevitably blew the money on luxury cars and cryptocurrency, the bank would foreclose on my townhouse. My parents were fully prepared to render me homeless, just to fund Jamal's delusions and maintain their fake country club facade. "Where is the application currently in the pipeline?" I demanded, feeling a cold, absolute fury crystallizing in my chest. "It is in the final underwriting stage," Nathaniel replied smoothly. "They submitted it 4 days ago. Traditional banks take about a week to finalize a home equity line of credit of this magnitude. They are rushing to secure the capital before your grandfather realizes they are broke and officially audits their finances. They needed my signature on that new lease agreement to prove to the bank that the property generates sufficient rental income to cover the new monthly loan payments," I said, the realization settling over me. "That is why Jamal texted me threatening to smear my name to the family. They did not just want an extra $1,000 a month from me. They needed that signed document to close a $500,000 heist." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "Exactly. You are the unknowing guarantor of their fraudulent loan. If we do not stop this, they will walk away with $500,000 in cash, and you will be left with a property saddled with a massive lien. When they default, the bank will seize your home." "Can we block it?" I asked. "I can file an emergency injunction to freeze the deed," Nathaniel stated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. It will place a hard stop on any pending financial encumbrances. The bank will immediately flag the application and halt the underwriting process. Your parents will receive a notification that the title is locked due to active litigation. No, I said instantly. If they get a notification from the bank today, they will know I am on to them. They will panic, destroy evidence, and possibly try to flee the jurisdiction with whatever cash they still have. We need to lock the deed without tipping them off. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by my strategic restraint. That requires a more delicate maneuver. I can file a quiet caveat under your grandfather's legal umbrella. Since he is the original grantor of the trust, I can petition the court to temporarily suspend trustee privileges pending a private financial review. The bank will quietly freeze the loan application under a routine compliance hold rather than a litigation flag. Your parents will simply think the bank is taking longer than expected to process the paperwork. Do it, I commanded. I want them waiting by the phone for a bank deposit that will never arrive. I want them sweating. Consider it done, Nathaniel said, executing the filing. But Madison, if they are this desperate for $500,000 to fund your brother-in-law, there is a massive deficit somewhere else in their ledger. People do not risk federal prison to fund a startup unless they are covering up a much larger financial catastrophe. He was absolutely right. The home equity loan was a band-aid for a massive hemorrhage. My parents were bleeding capital, and my stolen rent was no longer enough to stop it. I needed to find the source of the wound. I needed to investigate the only asset that consumed more cash than Jamal's fragile ego. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my designer briefcase. Freeze the deed, Nathaniel. I am going to find out exactly how deep their debt really goes. I left Nathaniel's office, the midday sun reflecting off the towering glass facades of the financial district. I did not return to the corporate headquarters of my financial firm. My direct manager knew I was handling a critical personal security breach and had granted me unlimited remote access for the week. I drove straight back to my townhouse, locked the heavy deadbolt, and powered up my workstation. The time for guessing was over. I was going to digitally dissect my brother-in-law until there was absolutely nothing left of his carefully curated facade. My target was Jamal. My 33-year-old brother-in-law loved to dominate family dinners with aggressive monologues about his revolutionary tech startup. He called his company Vanguard Quantum Dynamics. It was a name strategically designed to sound incredibly impressive at a country club dinner, yet it meant absolutely nothing to an actual software architect. He routinely claimed he was developing an artificial intelligence-driven logistics platform that would completely disrupt global supply chains. Grandpa Harrison was a self-made logistics billionaire. Jamal's choice of a fake industry was not a coincidence. It was a blatant, pathetic attempt to mirror my grandfather's success and secure a massive inheritance. I opened a secure terminal and pulled up the state business registry. Vanguard Quantum Dynamics was indeed listed as a registered limited liability company. I clicked on the corporate filing to check the registered agent address, expecting to find a lease for a sleek office space in a local technology park. Instead, the municipal coordinates pointed to a dilapidated strip mall situated between a discount dry cleaner and a fast food drive-thru. It was a commercial virtual mailbox service. Jamal was paying $50 a month to legally pretend he had a corporate headquarters. He had no office. He had a glorified post office box. If Jamal was actively pitching venture capital firms for an enterprise software application, he needed a minimum viable product. Investors do not hand over millions of dollars based on velvet tuxedos and buzzwords. They require functional code. I ran a comprehensive automated scrape of global code repositories targeting platforms like GitHub and GitLab. I deployed search algorithms using his legal name, his company name, and his known email aliases. The search returned 0 results. There were no code commits. There were no repository forks. There was absolutely 0 developer activity associated with his identity. I expanded my search to the iOS and Android commercial developer registries. Vanguard Quantum Dynamics had never submitted a single application for review. He was not a tech visionary. He was a highly successful parasite. I needed to know exactly how he was spending the $270,000 my parents had stolen from me. Jamal had just texted me demanding an extra $500 a month because his app was supposedly launching. I executed a deep web financial query, accessing public commercial credit registries and cross-referencing them with municipal tax lien databases. Jamal possessed no business credit line whatsoever. His company had never generated a single dollar of taxable revenue. However, his personal financial footprint was a masterclass in reckless consumption. I pulled the financing records for the brand new luxury SUV he loved to aggressively flaunt on Brittany's social media vlog. The vehicle was not purchased with tech money. It was leased directly under my father's legal name, with Jamal listed merely as a secondary driver. My parents were paying $2,000 a month for a luxury vehicle they did not even possess, effectively funding Jamal's illusion of wealth using the exact rental funds they systematically extorted from my bank account. But a car lease alone did not account for the sheer volume of missing capital. Jamal frequently posted screenshots of digital charts on his social media, bragging to his followers about his visionary investment strategies and generational wealth building. I ran his public wallet addresses through a blockchain tracing analytic tool. The data flow was entirely pathetic. He was not securing funding from elite angel investors. He was dumping massive, irregular amounts of cash into highly volatile alternative cryptocurrencies. He was essentially taking my hard-earned rent money and gambling it away on a digital roulette table, chasing viral trends while producing absolutely nothing of value. The picture was perfectly clear. My parents were completely financing a grown man who contributed absolutely nothing to society. They funded his luxury vehicles, his expensive designer wardrobes, and his reckless crypto gambling addiction. They did all of this while looking me dead in the eye at family gatherings, calling me a bitter, selfish spinster for wanting to keep my own corporate paycheck. They were perfectly willing to commit federal wire fraud and risk rendering their own daughter homeless just to keep Jamal's fragile ego inflated. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the sheer scale of the grift. Jamal had successfully socially engineered my parents into acting as his personal ATM. He manipulated their desperate need to project an image of a flawless high society family. Brittany gave them grandchildren, and Jamal gave them a fake tech empire to brag about at the country club. I was merely the silent workhorse, the invisible engine secretly powering their entire fraudulent lifestyle. But $500,000 in new debt was a massive escalation. Jamal's car lease and crypto habits were incredibly expensive, but they did not explain the frantic, reckless desperation required for my father to commit federal mortgage fraud. There was a massive black hole in their ledger. A catastrophic financial liability was forcing my father to make reckless, illegal maneuvers before Grandpa Harrison cut them off entirely. I closed the business registry window and opened a highly specialized real estate foreclosure database. I typed in the address of Brittany and Jamal's sprawling $1.5 million suburban mansion. If my parents were bleeding cash this rapidly, it was time to locate the primary hemorrhage. I hit enter on my keyboard, sending the query deep into the municipal servers. The address of Brittany and Jamal's sprawling $1.5 million suburban mansion processed through the system. I needed to see exactly how fragile their house of cards really was. The search results populated my right monitor in a cascade of municipal data. I opened the primary deed to the estate. As I expected, the property was not registered to Jamal. It was not registered to Brittany. The legal owners of the massive, meticulously landscaped suburban compound were Richard and Patricia. They had purchased the estate for their golden child, likely because Jamal possessed zero legitimate income and a credit history too toxic to secure a loan of that magnitude. My parents had leveraged their own names to give Brittany the perfect backdrop for her mommy vlogger videos. I clicked into the mortgage history, pulling the original lending documents. My eyes scanned the terms of the loan, and I actually shook my head in disbelief. This was not a standard conventional mortgage from a reputable national bank. This was a highly aggressive predatory loan from a secondary lending institution known for approving high-risk borrowers. My father had structured the financing with an alarmingly low down payment and an adjustable interest rate that was scheduled to balloon after 3 years. They were paying interest only relying entirely on the assumption of endless cash flow to keep the principal at bay. I opened my digital notepad and began mapping the cash flow. The minimum monthly payment on that toxic mortgage hovered right around $8,000. My parents were funneling my $4,500 stolen rent check directly to that predatory lender just to keep the lights on for Brittany. The remaining balance of the mortgage was heavily subsidized by the substantial monthly allowance Grandpa Harrison had been quietly providing to his son. Then came the Thanksgiving dinner. The moment Grandpa Harrison heard I was paying rent, he instantly recognized the financial anomaly. He knew he had purchased my townhouse in cash specifically to eliminate my housing overhead. By cutting off my father's corporate allowance in retaliation, Grandpa had instantly severed the main financial artery keeping their entire ecosystem alive. My stolen rent alone was not nearly enough to cover the massive ballooning mortgage on the suburban estate. The math simply did not work. I ran a secondary query on the property identification number, accessing the county clerk's civil litigation registry. A bright red flag illuminated my primary monitor. It was a formal notice of default. I downloaded the legal filing and read the stark, unforgiving text. Richard and Patricia were legally in default. The document was filed exactly 90 days after their last successful mortgage payment. The bank had officially initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings. They were tens of thousands of dollars in arrears. The lending institution explicitly granted them a strict 14-day cure period before initiating a public auction of the property. If they did not produce a massive lump sum of cash immediately, the sheriff would arrive at that pristine suburban mansion and physically evict my sister, her fake tech mogul husband, and all their designer luggage onto the sidewalk. The sheer gravity of their desperation finally crystallized into perfect clarity. This was the exact reason my father forged an application for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against my townhouse. It was never about seed funding for Jamal's non-existent technology startup. That was just a convenient lie they told each other to maintain their pride. They needed that $500,000 to cure the default on the mansion, pay off their crippling credit card debts, and artificially sustain their high society facade before Grandpa Harrison discovered they were entirely bankrupt. They were actively attempting to steal the equity of my home to pay the mortgage on Brittany's home. They were completely willing to sacrifice my financial security, saddle my property with a massive lien, and risk my eventual homelessness just to protect the golden child from facing the consequences of her own miserable choices. I opened another tab and pulled up Brittany's latest social media upload. She was standing in the grand foyer of the mansion they were about to lose, wearing a designer outfit funded by my stolen rent money. She smiled brightly into the camera, giving her followers a tour of her perfectly decorated living room and lecturing them about the importance of manifesting wealth through a positive mindset. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was currently 90 days past due and hovering on the absolute brink of total annihilation. The anger I expected to feel was completely absent. In its place was a profound icy calm. I did not feel betrayed anymore. I felt incredibly powerful. Knowledge is the ultimate weapon in any conflict, and I now possess the nuclear codes to their entire social existence. My parents truly believed they were in control. They believed the fraudulent lease agreement they just extorted from me would satisfy the underwriters at the bank, allowing their home equity loan to close. They believed they had successfully contained the damage, secured their survival at my expense, and outsmarted everyone. They had absolutely no idea that I was sitting in the dark watching their financial vitals flatline in real time. I had the power to simply let the bank take the house. I had the power to let them face public humiliation organically. But a simple foreclosure felt far too passive for the magnitude of their betrayal. If the bank foreclosed, they would simply blame a bad economy or a cruel lending institution. They would spin a narrative of victimhood cry to extended family members for sympathy and find a new way to manipulate their way out of accountability. I refused to let them control the narrative. I closed the foreclosure registry and looked at the offshore account balance glowing on my encrypted screen. I possessed enough liquid capital to fundamentally alter the rules of engagement. I did not just want to watch their empire burn from a distance. I wanted to own the ashes. The very next morning, I returned to the 42nd floor of the financial district. Nathaniel was already waiting for me in his glass corner office, 2 cups of black coffee steaming on his pristine desk. I did not waste time settling into the leather chair. I handed him the freshly signed fraudulent lease agreement. Patricia and Richard had countersigned it last night, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just provided the final piece of physical evidence required for a federal wire fraud indictment. Nathaniel inspected the digital signatures, a tight professional smile crossing his face. He scanned the document into his encrypted local server and placed the physical copy into a secure lockbox. The quiet caveat we filed yesterday is now actively attached to the deed of your townhouse, Nathaniel confirmed, tapping his keyboard. The county clerk approved the temporary suspension of trustee privileges at 8 o'clock this morning. When the commercial bank underwriting your parents' home equity line of credit attempts to pull the final title authorization today, they will hit a hard stop. The application for the $500,000 is officially dead in the water. Your parents will simply see a continuous pending status on their online portal. They will not receive a rejection letter immediately, which means they will remain paralyzed waiting for a bailout that is never going to arrive. I nodded, sipping my coffee. Blocking their theft was simply the defensive phase of my operation. Now we needed to pivot to a highly aggressive offensive strategy. I reached into my designer briefcase and pulled out the thick folder containing the municipal property data I had scraped the night before. I slid the notice of default across the glass desk. Nathaniel picked up the document. His eyes scanned the address, the loan origination details, and the staggering outstanding balance. He read the predatory interest rates and the formal declaration of pre-foreclosure. "This is the property where your sister and brother-in-law currently reside," he stated quickly, grasping the entire financial ecosystem my parents had constructed. Richard and Patricia are the primary borrowers. They leveraged their own credit to secure a $1.5 million asset using a highly volatile subprime mortgage instrument, and they are currently 90 days in arrears. The bank is legally authorized to initiate a public auction in exactly 14 days. They needed the $500,000 from my townhouse to cure this default and buy themselves more time, I explained calmly. Since you just neutralized their ability to steal my equity, they have absolutely zero avenues left to generate the capital required to save this estate. The predatory lending institution holding this mortgage is currently holding a toxic non-performing asset. Banks absolutely hate holding non-performing assets on their books, especially when the borrowers have a proven track record of severe delinquency. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the cool glass. I want to buy this debt, Nathaniel. I want to purchase the mortgage directly from the lender. Nathaniel actually stopped moving. For a man who navigated multi-million-dollar corporate litigation daily, he looked momentarily stunned. He set the notice of default down and looked at me with a completely new level of professional appraisal. Madison purchasing distressed debt from a commercial lender is a highly specialized maneuver. The bank will not sell a non-performing note of this magnitude to an individual retail investor. Furthermore, they will demand a massive cash settlement to offload the liability. We are talking about needing over $1 million in liquid capital ready to wire within 48 hours. I opened my encrypted tablet and authenticated my secure offshore banking portal. I turned the screen toward him. The balance glowing in green text was well over $3 million fully liquid, cleanly taxed, and immediately accessible. Nathaniel stared at the screen, a low whistle escaping his lips. He pushed his chair back and steepled his fingers. "You do not just want to evict them," he observed, his voice hushed with realization. "You want to completely own their reality." "Exactly," I replied. "If the bank forecloses, my parents will drag out the eviction process for months using bankruptcy protections and squatter tactics. They will play the victims to the rest of the family, If I own the debt, I control the timeline. I control the property. I want you to structure an anonymous corporate entity. I need a completely opaque limited liability company registered in a state with impenetrable corporate veil laws like Wyoming or Delaware. I want that entity to approach the predatory lender today and make a cash offer to purchase the distressed note on the mansion. Nathaniel immediately shifted into high gear. He pulled up a fresh legal drafting template. We will form a Wyoming LLC. The state laws there allow us to use a proxy registration service, meaning your name will not appear on any public-facing corporate registry. We will name the entity Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings will retain my firm as its legal counsel. I will act as the authorized representative to negotiate the purchase of the non-performing note from the lender. Because we are offering clean, immediate cash for a toxic asset, the bank will likely accept a slight discount on the principal just to clear their ledger. He typed furiously, assembling the articles of incorporation. Once Apex Holdings officially owns the mortgage, we instantly become the primary lien holder on the $1.5 million estate. Your parents will legally owe the entire ballooning debt directly to your anonymous corporation. We step right into the shoes of the bank. We inherit the active notice of default. And because the 14-day cure period is already ticking down, you will have the absolute legal authority to execute a total foreclosure and demand immediate eviction the second that clock runs out. I watched the legal framework materialize on his monitor. There was no emotion in the room. There was no crying about family betrayal or lamenting the loss of my childhood bonds. This was a flawless execution of corporate law. We were treating my parents like hostile corporate raiders, and we were engineering a perfectly legal, devastatingly effective hostile takeover of their most prized asset. Wire the formation fees from your offshore account immediately, Nathaniel instructed, hitting print on the proxy documents. I will have the LLC registered before noon. I will contact the commercial lender by 2 o'clock this afternoon with a proof of funds letter. We are going to buy your family's entire financial existence by the end of the business day. I signed the proxy authorization forms with a steady hand. The trap was officially drafted. By 1 in the afternoon, Nathaniel moved with terrifying efficiency. Within 3 hours, Apex Holdings was a fully registered Wyoming corporate entity, entirely shielded behind layers of proxy management and digital encryption. My name existed nowhere on the public filings. By early afternoon, Nathaniel had leveraged his firm's extensive industry contacts to secure a direct meeting with the regional risk management directors of the predatory lending institution holding the mortgage on the mansion. I accompanied him to their corporate headquarters, stepping into a sterile, aggressively air-conditioned boardroom that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and corporate panic. The room was devoid of any warmth, dominated by a massive frosted glass table and harsh fluorescent lighting. 3 bank executives sat across from us, looking thoroughly exhausted. They were actively managing a massive portfolio of toxic, non-performing assets, and my parents' particular loan was a bleeding wound on their quarterly ledger. The original mortgage was for $1.25 million, but it had been heavily inflated by consecutive missed payments, exorbitant late penalties, and compound interest. Nathaniel took control of the room instantly. He did not introduce me by my name, referring to me only as a silent investment partner representing the capital interests of Apex Holdings. He slid a single sheet of heavy stock paper across the polished glass table. It was a formal letter of intent to purchase the distressed mortgage note outright in hard cash with absolutely zero closing contingencies. The lead risk officer stared at the offer, his eyes darting nervously between Nathaniel and the printed document. In the world of high finance, a clean cash offer for a severely distressed subprime asset is basically a unicorn. We knew they were desperate to offload the liability before the end of the fiscal quarter to appease their shareholders. The lending institution desperately wanted to avoid the expensive, drawn-out legal nightmare of physically evicting a family with 3 young children. Forced evictions often result in property damage, massive legal fees, and terrible public relations. Nathaniel played masterfully on that exact corporate fear, highlighting the high-risk nature of the borrowers. He offered the executives a perfectly clean, immediate exit strategy. They simply had to assign the rights of the debt to my anonymous company. The negotiation was brutally short. The agreed purchase price was negotiated down to exactly $1.2 million. It was a staggering equity loss for my parents, but a brilliant liquidity recovery for the bank. The executives agreed to the financial terms within 20 minutes. They called in their internal legal counsel, who swiftly produced the assignment of mortgage documents, preparing to legally transfer the absolute right to collect the debt over to Apex Holdings. This was the moment of absolute, undeniable financial power. I opened my encrypted tablet right there in the center of the sterile boardroom. I bypassed standard retail banking interfaces, accessing my offshore accounts, using my secure institutional clearance protocols. My screen glowed with the eight-figure balance I had accumulated over the last decade through cybersecurity stock options, corporate consulting, and relentless financial discipline. I looked at the numbers, letting the sheer irony of the situation settle over me. My parents and my sister thought I was a pathetic, struggling spinster who needed to be extorted for $500 extra a month. Jamal thought he could intimidate me by threatening to call me selfish. They had absolutely no idea they were dealing with someone who could purchase their entire manufactured reality with a few keystrokes. I initiated the massive wire transfer. The authorization required a dual-factor biometric verification. I pressed my thumb against the illuminated screen authorizing the release of funds. The transaction processed instantly through the secured banking portal. $1.2 million flowed rapidly from my hidden offshore reserves, routed seamlessly through the Wyoming proxy accounts of Apex Holdings, and landed directly into the commercial lender's institutional clearing account. 5 minutes later, the lead executive's tablet chimed with the irrevocable wire confirmation. The physical relief in the sterile boardroom was instantly palpable. The bank officers visibly relaxed swiftly, signing the assignment paperwork and officially severing their corporate ties to the toxic loan. Nathaniel collected the fully executed documents, verifying the seals before sliding them securely into his designer briefcase. We shook hands with the executives and walked out. Stepping out of the high-rise building into the crisp afternoon air, the reality of the transaction washed over me like pure adrenaline. I did not just halt my parents' clumsy attempt to steal the equity from my townhouse. I had executed a flawless financial coup. I had effectively purchased the actual ground beneath their feet. Apex Holdings was now the primary lien holder on the $1.5 million suburban estate. I owned the title to the debt. I owned the legal rights to the default. I was now my parents' primary bank. I was my sister's ultimate landlord. I was the absolute architect of their impending destruction. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was another demanding text message from Patricia, asking if I had submitted the signed townhouse lease to their email yet. She was still desperately clinging to the illusion that she was pulling the strings, completely unaware that the puppet master had already left the theater. The 14-day cure period on the bank's original pre-foreclosure notice was still actively ticking down. The legal clock had not reset. In exactly 2 weeks, the grace period would officially expire. I had absolutely zero intention of offering them an extension, a payment plan, or an ounce of mercy. I smiled coldly, sliding the phone back into my pocket without replying today. I had the legal documents, the absolute financial leverage, and the perfect corporate trap ready to spring. Now, I just needed to secure the final piece of evidence from my parents to ensure the federal wire fraud charges would stick flawlessly, making their eventual downfall absolutely inevitable. The next morning required a masterful performance. I needed to shift from the ruthless architect of a financial takeover back into the docile, easily intimidated middle child. In cybersecurity, we call this deploying a honeypot. A honeypot is a decoy system designed to look incredibly vulnerable to attackers. You intentionally leave the digital front door open, inviting hackers to execute their malware. As they confidently navigate what they believe is an unsecured network, they are completely unaware that every single keystroke, every downloaded file, and every malicious command is being recorded on a secure shadow server for their impending prosecution. I was about to turn myself into a human honeypot. I sent a brief, carefully worded text message to my mother early Thursday morning. I kept my tone submissive and apologetic, claiming I had been overwhelmed by work stress and asking if we could meet for coffee to finalize the townhouse paperwork. Patricia responded within 3 minutes, eagerly setting a time at an upscale artisan cafe located right in the center of their affluent suburban neighborhood. They wanted me on their turf, surrounded by the wealthy facade they so desperately needed to protect. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early. I purposely wore a drab gray sweater and minimal makeup, manifesting the exhausted persona they expected to see. Through the large glass windows, I watched Richard and Patricia pull into the parking lot in the luxury sedan that was entirely funded by my stolen rent. They walked into the cafe radiating an obnoxious level of unearned confidence. Patricia wore oversized designer sunglasses and carried a pristine leather tote bag. Richard looked every bit the wealthy patriarch, sporting a cashmere coat and a condescending smile. They ordered expensive espresso drinks and sat down across from me at a small corner table. They did not ask how I was doing. They did not apologize for the brutal confrontation at Thanksgiving. They immediately got down to the business of extracting capital. Richard did not waste time. He unzipped his leather portfolio and pulled out a crisp, freshly printed stack of papers. He slid the document across the small wooden table, tapping his index finger right next to the signature line. It was the physical copy of the fraudulent lease agreement demanding $5,500 a month. "We appreciate you finally coming to your senses, Madison," my father stated, his voice dripping with paternal authority. "Your mother and I understand that seeing your sister succeed can trigger some jealousy, but throwing a tantrum at a holiday dinner is simply unacceptable. We are willing to overlook your outburst provided you sign this updated lease today. The bank needs the physical paperwork finalized by this afternoon to update our property management files." He was lying flawlessly. The bank needed the signed lease to underwrite their fraudulent $500,000 home equity loan, not to update property management files. I looked down at the document. The header boldly claimed Richard and Patricia were the legal landlords of the property. Every single word printed on those pages was a direct violation of the actual blind trust Grandpa Harrison had established. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting deep hesitation. I stared at the paper, as if the financial weight of the extortion was physically crushing me. "This is a huge increase, Dad," I murmured, keeping my voice small and wavering. $5,500 a month is going to drain my entire paycheck. I will barely have enough left over for groceries or utilities." Patricia scoffed quietly, taking a delicate sip of her vanilla latte. She leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with a toxic mixture of triumph and greed. She believed she had me completely backed into a corner. "It is for the best, darling." Patricia smirked, her tone weaponizing the concept of family loyalty. "Jamal's app is about to launch any day now. He has investors lined up around the block, but they need to see a stable lifestyle before they commit the big funds. You will be proud you invested in family when Vanguard Quantum Dynamics goes public. Just think of this rent increase as your contribution to our overall legacy." I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who was perfectly willing to bankrupt her own daughter to fund a velvet-wearing grifter who operated out of a strip mall virtual mailbox. I did not argue. I did not point out the sheer insanity of her logic. I simply gave her a weak, trembling smile that perfectly mimicked utter defeat. "Okay," I whispered softly, "if it helps the family. If it—" I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy, dark blue ink pen. I uncapped it and pressed the nib against the thick paper. I signed my name on the tenant line with slow, deliberate strokes. Then I pushed the document back across the table toward my father. You both need to sign as the landlords, I said, keeping my eyes cast downward. My accounting department requires fully executed counter-signatures for any housing adjustments related to my corporate payroll deductions. Richard did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He was too eager to secure the collateral for his impending bank loan. He grabbed the pen and scrawled his signature on the landlord line. He handed the pen to Patricia, who cheerfully added her own flourishing signature right beneath his. They smiled at each other, practically vibrating with relief. They had secured the document they needed. They thought they had secured their financial salvation. I need a copy for my personal files, I requested meekly. Richard nodded his head, sliding the fully executed duplicate into my waiting hands. They walked out of the upscale cafe radiating absolute unearned victory. I remained quietly at the corner table, my pulse entirely steady. They had unknowingly provided the exact physical ammunition Nathaniel needed today. Federal wire fraud was now completely inescapable. Now it was time to visit Grandpa Harrison. I drove straight to the affluent neighborhood where Grandpa resided. I drove up to the main house, grabbed my briefcase containing the fraudulent lease and the dossier of their crimes, and walked directly to his private study. Grandpa was sitting behind a walnut desk, reviewing logistics manifests with a red pen. He looked up when I entered, his sharp eyes registering my calculated determination. He set the pen down. I walked straight to his desk, pulled out the meticulously organized binder, and dropped it squarely in the center of his workspace. I think it is time we had a serious conversation about the Madison Harrison Revocable Trust, I stated evenly, sitting opposite him. Grandpa leaned back, his expression unreadable. I assumed we would have this discussion eventually, he replied, his voice a low baritone. When you mentioned paying rent at the Thanksgiving table, I knew immediately that Richard and Patricia had breached their fiduciary duties. I bought that townhouse in cash 5 years ago to ensure you had a secure asset. I appointed them as trustees strictly to handle the property taxes. I take it they decided to exploit that authority. They did much more than exploit it, I corrected. I slid the newly executed lease agreement across the desk. They forged their authority to act as the legal owners. They created a fake management company and extorted $270,000 from me over the past 60 months. 2 hours ago, they threatened to smear my reputation unless I signed this new contract, increasing the extortion to $5,500 a month. Grandpa Harrison looked at their signatures. He did not gasp. His breathing remained steady, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Men like my grandfather do not react to betrayal with emotional outbursts. They react with surgical precision. Where exactly did the capital go? Grandpa asked. Siphoning $250,000 from your own daughter requires a specific urgent deficit. I pulled out the financial audit I ran on Jamal and the property records for the suburban mansion. It went to funding your golden son-in-law's fake tech empire, I explained. I laid out the public registry documents showing Vanguard Quantum Dynamics was nothing but a virtual mailbox in a strip mall. Jamal has 0 revenue, 0 code commits, and 0 investors. He has been draining my stolen rent money to lease luxury SUVs, buy designer clothes, and gamble on cryptocurrencies to maintain the illusion of a Silicon Valley visionary. I watched my grandfather absorb the data. Seeing empirical proof that a man was wearing velvet tuxedos funded by stolen money made his jaw clench. But the final piece is the most devastating. I continued, sliding the notice of default across the desk. The stolen rent was not enough to keep the charade afloat. When you cut off my father's allowance after Thanksgiving, you triggered a financial collapse. The $1.5 million mansion is financed through a predatory lender. They are 90 days past due. The bank initiated pre-foreclosure. They are entirely bankrupt, Grandpa. They needed me to sign that fake lease today to prove rental income so they could take out a $500,000 home equity loan against my townhouse. They were completely willing to risk my property to save Brittany and Jamal from being evicted. Grandpa Harrison stared at the red flag printed on the notice of default. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. It was the terrifying silence of a patriarch realizing his own son was entirely devoid of a moral compass. His eyes were cold, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. I built this family with blood and sweat. Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. I worked 18-hour days on loading docks to create generational wealth so my children would never know the sting of poverty. They took that legacy and turned it into a pathetic circus. They chose to feed a parasite and cannibalize their own daughter to maintain a lie. He pushed the fraudulent lease agreement back toward me. I had already spoken with my corporate attorneys this morning regarding Richard's role in the logistics firm, Grandpa stated. But you clearly have a specific operational strategy in motion. What is your next move, Madison? I placed my final document on his desk, the assignment of mortgage paperwork executed by my lawyer. I did not just block their home equity loan, I revealed. I used my offshore capital to establish an anonymous corporate entity. I purchased the distressed debt on the mansion directly from the predatory lender yesterday afternoon. I am now the primary lien holder on that estate. I own the absolute legal right to their default. Grandpa Harrison leaned forward, a spark of genuine ruthless pride flashing in his eyes. He recognized the magnitude of the financial checkmate I had engineered. I had outmaneuvered a massive commercial bank and trapped my parents in an inescapable legal snare. "Burn it down, Madison," Grandpa commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "You have my full blessing. Do whatever is necessary to completely dismantle their facade." I pulled a blank legal template from my briefcase. "Then we need to draft the paperwork right now," I said. "Because the bank's original cure period expires right before the holidays. We are going to prepare a formal 14-day eviction notice for the mansion." Grandpa Harrison reached into his desk and pulled out a heavy fountain pen. "Let us make sure the legal terminology is absolutely flawless," he agreed. We sat together in the quiet study, combining his decades of ruthless corporate experience with my calculated tactical execution. We made sure there were zero legal loopholes, zero grace periods, and zero room for negotiation. We finalized the eviction notice, aligning our forces for the impending devastation. The trap was fully constructed and ready to snap shut on Christmas Eve. The trap was fully constructed and ready to snap shut on Christmas Eve. But the legal documents sitting inside my designer briefcase were only half of the impending annihilation. While I spent the week leading up to the holiday finalizing the tactical logistics of my hostile takeover, Grandpa Harrison initiated his own parallel offensive. He had returned to the executive headquarters of his logistics firm with a singular, ruthless objective. He was going to financially dissect his own son. Richard had served as the regional vice president at the family company for over 15 years. He loved using the corporate title to leverage VIP tables at upscale restaurants and secure premium tea times at the country club. He strutted around the suburban neighborhoods, projecting the image of an indispensable corporate titan. In reality, Grandpa had essentially created a bloated middle management role specifically to keep my father employed, tolerating his mediocre performance out of familial obligation. But the revelation of the stolen rent money and the fraudulent blind trust had entirely extinguished that obligation. Grandpa Harrison did not announce the audit. He did not send a calendar invite or request a preliminary meeting with my father. Corporate predators do not warn their prey. Instead, Grandpa bypassed Richard entirely and directly ordered the external forensic accounting firm to execute a completely unannounced deep-level sweep of Richard's entire regional division. They seized his corporate servers, mirrored his hard drives, and began running advanced analytic algorithms on every single expense report, vendor invoice, and corporate credit card statement filed over the last 48 months. 3 days before Christmas Eve, Grandpa summoned me back to his private study. The massive walnut desk was completely cleared save for a single thick manila folder resting dead center. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, noting the absolute frigid stillness in his posture. "They finished the forensic sweep this morning," Grandpa stated, his baritone voice devoid of any warmth. "I expected to find gross incompetence. I expected to find reckless corporate spending to mask his personal debt. I did not expect to find systematic, premeditated embezzlement." I leaned forward, my cybersecurity instincts instantly locking onto the breach. "How much did he take?" Grandpa opened the folder and turned the top page toward me. It was a sprawling, highlighted spreadsheet tracking dozens of phantom transactions. Richard did not just use the corporate card for unauthorized luxury dinners, Grandpa explained with icy precision. He established a network of ghost vendors. He generated fake invoices for consulting services, logistics software upgrades, and warehouse maintenance that never actually occurred. He authorized the payments through his regional budget, bypassing the standard accounting protocols by keeping the individual amounts just under the threshold that triggers a secondary executive review. I scanned the destination routing numbers highlighted in red ink. My eyes narrowed as I recognized the financial footprint. The embezzled corporate funds were not staying in my parents' accounts. They were flowing directly into the exact same local credit union account they used to intercept my stolen rent money. Where exactly was the corporate capital going after it hit their personal accounts? I asked, already knowing the sickening answer. Grandpa flipped to the next page, revealing a devastating flowchart mapping the final destinations of the stolen money. Richard used my company's capital to pay Patricia's exorbitant country club dues. He used it to cover the massive balloon payments on the predatory mortgage tied to that ridiculous suburban mansion. And most egregiously, he routinely wired large lump sums directly to Vanguard Quantum Dynamics. He was actively financing Jamal's completely fraudulent technology startup, using capital stolen directly from my corporate treasury. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. My father had not just committed federal wire fraud by intercepting my trust fund. He had been actively embezzling from his own father's legacy to fund a velvet-wearing grifter who contributed absolutely nothing to society. Richard had cannibalized both his daughter and his father to sustain an artificial reality built entirely on pathological pride. What is the corporate protocol for this level of theft? I asked, maintaining perfect clinical detachment. If he were an ordinary employee, I would have him escorted out of the building in handcuffs by local law enforcement, Grandpa replied without hesitation. But a public arrest would trigger a massive scandal. It would alert the media, cause panic among our shareholders, and instantly tank our quarterly stock valuation. I will not allow Richard's pathetic desperation to damage the empire I built with my own hands. I am handling this internally, and I am handling it with maximum absolute severity. Grandpa reached into the breast pocket of his suit and withdrew a crisp, sealed white envelope. He placed it deliberately on top of the forensic audit folder. This is a formal termination letter executed with absolute cause, Grandpa stated, his eyes locking onto mine. By terminating him with documented cause for corporate embezzlement, he instantly forfeits all unvested stock options. He receives zero severance pay. And because he violated the core fiduciary morality clause of his executive contract, his entire corporate pension is completely nullified. I am legally stripping him of every single financial safety net he possesses. He is walking away with absolutely nothing. I looked at the sealed white envelope. It was not just a piece of paper. It was a financial execution order. It represented the total instantaneous destruction of my father's entire identity. Without his vice president title and his corporate credit card, Richard was nothing but a broke, aging fraud facing imminent homelessness. Grandpa Harrison pushed the envelope slowly across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of my hands. I want you to take this, Madison, Grandpa commanded softly. You are attending that lavish Christmas Eve party at the mansion tomorrow night. Richard will undoubtedly attempt to use that audience to showcase his fake success and humiliate you into submission. He will stand in a house he cannot afford, boasting about a lifestyle funded by theft. When he reaches the absolute peak of his arrogance, when he feels completely invincible in front of all his guests, I want you to hand him this envelope. I want you to look him dead in the eye and deliver the final blow. I reached out and picked up the heavy white envelope. The premium cardstock felt cold against my fingertips. I slid it carefully into my designer briefcase, placing it perfectly alongside the 14-day eviction notice and the federal fraud dossier. The ammunition was fully loaded. The target was firmly locked. Consider it done, Grandpa, I replied, zipping the briefcase shut. I walked out of his study and stepped into the freezing winter air. The city was glowing with festive holiday lights, completely ignorant of the absolute devastation I was about to unleash. Tomorrow night, my family was going to host the most expensive, glamorous Christmas Eve party of their entire lives. And tomorrow night, I was going to systematically burn their entire empire straight to the ground. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the sprawling $1.5 million suburban estate exactly 24 hours later. The massive property was completely illuminated, dripping in thousands of imported holiday lights that cast a blinding artificial glow across the manicured snow. A line of luxury vehicles snaked up the circular driveway where hired valet attendants in crisp uniforms hurried to open doors for arriving guests. I handed my keys to a young valet stepping out into the freezing night air with my designer briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. I looked up at the towering brick facade. Behind those massive double doors, my family was hosting the social event of the season, completely blind to the fact that they were throwing a party in a house I now legally owned. I walked through the grand entrance and was immediately hit by a wall of manufactured extravagance. Over 50 guests milled about the expansive open-concept living area. A professional string quartet occupied the corner of the grand foyer playing classical holiday arrangements that echoed through the high ceilings. Hired catering staff balanced silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres, weaving seamlessly through groups of extended relatives, country club acquaintances, and various suburban socialites. In the center of the massive dining room stood a towering, custom-carved ice sculpture of a swan slowly melting into a crystal basin. The sheer volume of money bleeding out of this single evening was staggering, especially knowing that every single dime was leveraged on toxic debt and stolen capital. I navigated the crowded room with calculated precision, my eyes scanning the terrain. The contrast between their fake luxury and their impending doom was almost cinematic. Patricia was stationed near the imported marble fireplace, wearing a glittering floor-length evening gown. She was aggressively holding court with a group of affluent neighborhood wives loudly boasting about Richard's latest supposedly massive logistics deals and Jamal's impending technology breakthrough. Richard stood a few feet away, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, laughing robustly with two men he played golf with. He looked incredibly smug, projecting the absolute pinnacle of corporate success. He was entirely oblivious to the white envelope resting securely inside my briefcase. An envelope that would instantly strip him of his title, his pension, and his entire identity by Monday morning. A flash of bright light caught my attention near the sweeping grand staircase. Brittany was holding her smartphone on a professional gimbal, live streaming the extravagant holiday party to her thousands of devoted followers. She wore a stunning crimson silk dress that probably cost more than a standard mortgage payment. Her perfectly manicured hand fluttered as she adjusted her hair for the camera, performing her role flawlessly. "Merry Christmas Eve, everyone!" Brittany cooed into her microphone, projecting her flawless mommy vlogger persona. "We are just feeling so incredibly blessed tonight. Surrounding yourself with family and creating true generational wealth is what the holidays are all about. Jamal has been working so hard on his new startup, and we are just taking a moment to celebrate our beautiful, wealthy life before his company goes global next quarter. I am just so grateful for this amazing home and the empire we are building." She panned the camera around the room, making sure to capture the ice sculpture and the string quartet selling an absolute lie to an audience of strangers. She did not know her empire was exactly 14 days away from a brutal sheriff's eviction. I bypassed the catering staff and made my way toward the back of the dining room. I wanted to establish my physical presence before executing the drop. That was when I saw him. Jamal emerged from the crowd wearing a custom-tailored deep burgundy velvet tuxedo that screamed unearned arrogance. He spotted me instantly. A wide, predatory smirk spread across his face as he broke away from his conversation and marched directly toward me. He cornered me deliberately, trapping me between the massive ice sculpture and the edge of the dining table. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of top-shelf bourbon. He clearly believed he had completely broken me. He believed his manipulative text message had successfully terrorized me into submission. He thought the quiet, boring IT worker had finally surrendered her paycheck to fund his delusions. Well, look who finally decided to join the winning team. Jamal murmured, his voice low and dripping with condescension. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes raking over my simple, unbranded black dress. Did you sign the lease, Maddie Goodgirl? I knew you would come to your senses once you realized how much this family needs your contribution. Keep funding the empire and maybe one day we will let you sit at the adult table. I did not flinch. I did not glare or offer a witty defensive comeback. I maintained absolute clinical eye contact. I let his arrogant words hang in the freezing air between us. My face remained a mask of pristine calm. I slowly raised my hand and gently patted the thick leather of my designer briefcase resting against my side. Oh, I brought all the paperwork tonight, Jamal. I replied, my voice smooth, polite, and completely devoid of fear. Every single page. I wanted to make sure the entire family gets exactly what they earned for Christmas. Jamal chuckled, completely missing the lethal undertone in my voice. He thought he had won. He patted my shoulder with mocking affection, turned around and walked back into the crowd to continue playing the role of a visionary tech mogul. I watched him go, feeling the cold weight of the briefcase in my hand. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was completely captivated by the illusion. It was time to pull the curtain down. The catering staff moved through the massive room like clockwork, carrying silver trays and guiding the 50 guests toward the grand dining area. The long banquet table was a masterpiece of financial irresponsibility. Towering floral arrangements cascaded down the center, interspersed with heavy crystal candelabras that cast a flickering golden light over the imported china. I took my assigned seat near the far end of the table, flanked by a distant cousin and an affluent neighborhood wife, who had spent the last 20 minutes complaining about the wait list for a luxury country club. I placed my designer briefcase on the floor right next to my velvet chair, keeping the leather handle resting lightly against my calf. The dull roar of 50 overlapping conversations filled the space as the caterers poured vintage champagne into crystal flutes. The clinking of glasses created a sharp musical rhythm that echoed off the high ceiling. It was the sound of a carefully manufactured high society illusion operating at peak performance. My mother sat at the opposite end of the long table, her posture perfectly straight, nodding graciously as guests complimented the sheer extravagance of the holiday spread. Jamal and Brittany sat near the center, holding court like suburban royalty. Then the sharp, authoritative sound of a silver spoon tapping against crystal cut through the noise. The conversations immediately died down. My father stood at the head of the table. He buttoned his tailored cashmere jacket and raised his champagne flute, projecting the absolute confidence of a self-made corporate titan. He smiled warmly at his captive audience, soaking in the collective attention. "Welcome, everyone," Richard began, his baritone voice carrying effortlessly across the silent dining room. "Patricia and I are incredibly blessed to have you all here tonight to share in the warmth of the holiday season. Christmas is a time to reflect on what truly matters. It is a time to celebrate our foundations, our legacy, and most importantly, our family." He gestured grandly toward the center of the table. "As many of you know, this has been a remarkable year of growth for the people I love most. I want to take a moment to acknowledge my brilliant son-in-law, Jamal. He has been working with relentless dedication to launch a technology platform that is going to completely revolutionize his industry. Jamal, your vision is inspiring. You are the future of tech, and this family could not be prouder to stand behind your impending global success." The guests murmured their approval. A few people clapped politely. Jamal offered a humble practice nod, raising his own glass in acknowledgement. He looked exactly like a man who was not secretly 90 days past due on a predatory mortgage. My father turned his glowing admiration toward his golden child. "And to my beautiful daughter, Brittany, you are the absolute heart of this home. Managing a massive household, raising 3 perfect children, and supporting a visionary husband is a monumental task. You handle it with flawless grace. You are the perfect mother, the perfect wife, and the absolute anchor of this new generation." Brittany beamed, her eyes sparkling for the camera she had propped up on the table to record the entire speech for her followers. She reached over and squeezed Jamal's hand, playing the devoted matriarch to perfection. I sat perfectly still, taking a slow, measured sip of my water. I knew exactly how my father operated. The grand praise was simply the setup. The emotional manipulation was the main course. Richard let the applause fade before he shifted his weight. His smile altered slightly, transitioning from glowing pride to a mask of condescending paternal pity. He turned his head and locked his eyes directly onto me at the far end of the banquet table. 50 pairs of eyes immediately followed his gaze. Of course, building a lasting empire requires everyone to row in the same direction, Richard continued, his tone dripping with patronizing affection. And sometimes it takes certain family members a little longer to understand the true value of our shared legacy. I want to raise a very special toast to my middle daughter, Madison. The silence in the room grew heavy. The neighborhood wife sitting next to me shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Madison has always walked a different, quieter path, my father announced to the crowd, his voice projecting a fake, sorrowful patience. She works a simple IT job. She lives a very solitary life. We all know she has her limitations when it comes to understanding the complex dynamics of high-level business and family building. There were times when Patricia and I worried she might isolate herself, completely succumbing to the bitterness of watching her sister achieve the milestones she could not reach. He paused dramatically, letting the insult hang in the air. He was publicly branding me as a jealous, incompetent spinster in front of his entire social circle. It was a calculated psychological strike designed to strip me of any dignity and force me into absolute compliance. But the magic of the holiday season is about coming together, Richard proclaimed, his smile returning with a predatory edge. I am incredibly proud to announce that Madison has finally learned the value of supporting her betters. She has chosen to step out of her isolation and become a true part of this family's future. My father reached into the inside pocket of his cashmere jacket. He pulled out a folded legal document. It was not the rental lease I had signed at the coffee shop. It was the formal application for the $500,000 home equity line of credit against my townhouse. He had brought the loan documents to the dinner table. Madison has graciously agreed to co-sign the final business loan for Jamal's technology startup tonight, Richard declared loudly, holding the document up for the crowd to see. She is placing her full financial support behind her brother-in-law's genius. She is proving that even those who cannot build an empire themselves can still find purpose by investing in the family members who can. Let us hear it for Madison. The dining room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. 50 wealthy guests turned to look at me, smiling and clapping for my supposed generosity. Brittany wiped a fake tear from her eye. Jamal raised his bourbon glass directly at me, a victorious sneer plastered across his face. Patricia signaled to a caterer who immediately walked over to my chair carrying a silver tray. Resting on the polished metal was the multi-page loan application and a heavy gold pen. The trap was flawless. They had cornered me in front of 100 witnesses. If I refused to sign the documents right there, I would look like a spiteful, unhinged, jealous sister ruining a beautiful holiday dinner. I would be the villain in their perfect suburban fairy tale. They were trying to use peer pressure and public humiliation to extort $500,000 of equity from my stolen property. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They believed their social engineering attack was an absolute success. I did not panic. I did not shrink back into my chair or burst into tears of embarrassment. I looked at the silver tray. I looked at the gold pen. Then I looked directly at my father. I placed my water glass down on the table, reached down to the floor, and picked up my heavy designer briefcase. I unzipped the premium leather of my briefcase with a sharp, definitive pull. The sound was surprisingly loud in the grand dining room, slicing right through the fading remnants of polite applause. The caterer holding the silver tray hesitated, taking a small step backward as I ignored the gold pen completely. I stood up from my velvet chair, drawing myself to my full height. The sudden movement disrupted the carefully choreographed flow of the evening. The guests who had been smiling and clapping just seconds ago now faltered, their hands dropping to their laps as a wave of collective confusion rippled down the long banquet table. Richard's triumphant smile froze, his hand still holding the fraudulent loan application aloft, for his audience lowered a fraction of an inch. He expected me to sit quietly, lower my head in submission, and sign away $500,000 of my equity to avoid a public scene. He expected the overwhelming pressure of 50 affluent onlookers to crush my willpower. He fundamentally misunderstood who was actually controlling this room. I projected my voice, ensuring it carried effortlessly over the massive floral arrangements and crystal candelabras reaching every single corner of the sprawling dining room. I am not co-signing anything, I stated, my tone absolute and completely devoid of emotion. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. The affluent neighborhood wife sitting to my left actually gasped, pressing her hand to her pearl necklace. Jamal's victorious sneer instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sudden panicked confusion. Brittany lowered her smartphone, the live stream still recording her perfectly contoured face contorting into an ugly expression of shock. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He took a step forward, dropping his paternal facade. "Madison, this is not the time for your dramatics," he hissed, trying to keep his voice low enough to salvage the situation. "Sit down and sign the document. We will discuss your behavioral issues later." I did not sit down. I reached into my open briefcase and retrieved the first of 3 thick, heavily indexed manila folders. I held it up for a brief second, letting the bright artificial lighting illuminate the dense stack of legal documents inside. But since we are talking about finances, I continued speaking directly to the captive audience of country club friends, distant relatives, and suburban socialites. I think everyone here should see exactly how this family builds its empire. I dropped the thick folder directly onto the polished wood of the dining table. The heavy, authoritative thud echoed like a gunshot across the dead silent room. I flipped the cover open, spreading the top layers of the documents across the table so the people sitting nearest to me could clearly see the federal seals, the bank letterheads, and the official county clerk watermarks. "My father loves to talk about supporting family," I announced, maintaining intense, unblinking eye contact with Richard at the opposite end of the table. "He loves to brag about his real estate investments. For the last 5 years, my parents have told everyone, including me, that they generously allowed me to rent a luxury townhouse they purchased as an investment property. They charged me $4,500 a month, claiming they were giving me a steep family discount." I gestured to the first stack of papers. "These are the certified unredacted property records and trust documents. They prove that my grandfather Harrison bought that exact townhouse in cash 5 years ago. He did not buy it for Richard. He bought it for me. He placed it into a blind trust completely in my name, specifically so I would never have to pay housing costs. My parents were legally appointed strictly to manage the property taxes using my grandfather's funds." The murmurs around the table completely ceased. The silence became absolute, terrifyingly still. The guests were staring at the documents, then staring at my parents. The illusion of the perfect wealthy patriarch was disintegrating in real time. I picked up the fake lease agreement my parents had eagerly countersigned at the Artisan Cafe just yesterday morning and held it up. Instead of telling me about my grandfather's gift, my parents fabricated a fake property management company. I explained, my voice ringing out with clinical precision. They forged their legal authority. They created fake lease agreements. They forced their own daughter to pay rent to live in a house she already owned. $4,500 every single month for 60 months. I let the math hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the absolute truth. That is $270,000. Richard and Patricia stole over $250,000 from their own daughter. They used my stolen money to pay for country club memberships they could not afford. They used it to lease luxury SUVs for a son-in-law who refuses to work. They used it to artificially sustain the absolute lie that they are a wealthy, successful family. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in the headlights of his own massive deception. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his golfing buddies, his business acquaintances, and his affluent neighbors. He saw the stark disgust registering on their faces. The men he had just been boasting to were now looking at him like he was a common thief. Jamal stepped forward, his velvet tuxedo suddenly looking incredibly cheap. "You are crazy," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are making this up because you are jealous. Security, get her out of my house right now." I did not even look at Jamal. I kept my eyes locked onto my mother. Patricia was standing near the fireplace, her glittering evening gown sparkling mockingly against her pale, horrified face. She was gripping her crystal wine glass so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. She knew exactly what those documents represented. She knew her entire social existence was permanently destroyed. I delivered the final, devastating strike of the first phase. "I did not come here today to cause a scene," I stated, my voice echoing with icy legal finality. "I came here to deliver a notification. Because I secured your physical signatures on that fraudulent lease agreement yesterday morning, I handed my lawyer irrefutable proof of your crimes. My attorney filed felony wire and mail fraud charges against both of you with the federal authorities this morning." At the word felony, the last remaining shred of Patricia's composure completely snapped. Her hand convulsed. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the imported hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering, jagged pieces. The dark red wine splashed across the floorboards, looking exactly like fresh blood spreading across the pristine surface of their fake manufactured lives. The sharp sound of the breaking glass was the only noise in the entire mansion. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the bomb I had just detonated right in the middle of their perfect Christmas Eve. But I was not finished. The first folder had successfully dismantled my parents. Now it was time to drop the second folder and completely obliterate the golden child and her grifter husband. I reached back into my designer briefcase. The sound of the shattered crystal breaking against the imported hardwood floor acted as a starting pistol for the absolute chaos that followed. A low collective murmur of shock rippled through the 50 guests. Affluent neighbors began whispering frantically to one another, their eyes darting from the spilled red wine to the stack of federal fraud documents resting on the dining table. Several people instinctively took a step backward, physically distancing themselves from my parents, as if financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. Richard finally snapped out of his paralysis. His face, previously pale with shock, suddenly turned a mottled, furious shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar as he frantically tried to regain control of his imploding social standing. He held up his hands toward the crowd, desperately attempting to project his usual authoritative calm, but his voice shook violently. "This is a complete misunderstanding." Richard stammered his words, tripping over each other in a desperate scramble for an excuse. "It is just a minor family miscommunication regarding complex accounting protocols. Madison is clearly overreacting to a simple administrative error. We will sort this out privately in the morning. There is absolutely no fraud taking place here. Please, everyone, return to your meals." No one in the room believed a single syllable. The evidence was sitting right in front of them, bearing official government seals and notarized signatures. The wealthy businessmen he had been trying to impress just moments ago were now looking at him with naked, unfiltered contempt. Jamal realized the protective bubble of his in-laws' wealth was rapidly collapsing around him. He needed to reassert his dominance to save face in front of the catered staff and the affluent guests he had been aggressively networking with all evening. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his burgundy velvet tuxedo jacket, and marched toward me with aggressive, heavy footsteps. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, trying to project raw intimidation. "You are completely crazy," Jamal shouted, trying to sound like a commanding tech mogul dealing with a hysterical relative. "You come in here making wild, baseless accusations because you are bitter and alone. I will not tolerate this blatant disrespect in my own home." He turned his head and bellowed toward the foyer where the hired event staff were standing. "Security, get her out of my house immediately. Escort her off my property right now before I call the police and have her arrested for trespassing." Two hired security guards in black suits stepped uncertainly into the dining room. They looked between Jamal's furious posturing and my unwavering stance, entirely unsure of how to proceed. I did not back away from Jamal. I did not flinch at his loud demands or break eye contact. I maintained my pristine, icy calm, acting as an impenetrable firewall against his emotional outburst. I reached my hand back into my designer briefcase and pulled out the second thick manila folder. I held it up high so the entire room, including the hesitant security guards, could see it clearly under the chandelier lighting. I dropped the second folder onto the table right next to the first one. The heavy slap of the thick paper hitting the solid wood cut sharply through Jamal's shouting. "Actually, Jamal," I stated, my voice echoing with lethal, undeniable clarity, "this is not your house. It never was." Jamal froze mid-step, his arm dropping slowly to his side. The aggressive posturing instantly vanished from his frame, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization that I was holding the actual receipts to his entire fabricated existence. "You love to brag to everyone in this room about your massive tech startup and your eager angel investors." I continued, ensuring every single guest could hear me perfectly over the quiet hum of the ventilation system. "But I ran a full forensic financial audit on Vanguard Quantum Dynamics last night. Your revolutionary technology empire is nothing but a shell company registered to a virtual mailbox at a discount strip mall. You have zero corporate clients. You have zero developer code commits. You have zero taxable revenue. The only thing you have successfully engineered is a pipeline to drain my stolen rent money so you can lease luxury cars and lose thousands of dollars gambling on alternative cryptocurrencies." The guests gasped collectively. A few people actually pulled out their smartphones unabashedly, recording the confrontation to share with their own social circles later. Brittany let out a strangled, high-pitched sob from the other side of the room, her perfect mommy vlogger facade shattering entirely as her followers watched the live stream broadcast her husband's absolute exposure. "But that is only the beginning of your severe financial reality," I said, turning my gaze back to Jamal, whose face had completely drained of color, leaving a sickly gray pallor behind. "You just ordered security to remove me from your property, but the public deed shows you do not own a single brick of this estate. Richard and Patricia bought this mansion for you using a highly predatory adjustable-rate subprime mortgage because your personal credit history is entirely toxic. And because you refuse to secure actual employment, they have been using the $4,500 they stole from me every month just to cover the minimum interest payments." I tapped the thick cover of the second folder with my index finger. "When Grandpa Harrison cut off my father's corporate allowance after Thanksgiving, your entire cash flow completely evaporated. This property is currently 90 days past due. The lending institution filed a formal notice of default last week. They have officially initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings. You are entirely bankrupt, Jamal. You do not possess an empire. You are an unemployed grifter living in a house that is about to be seized and auctioned by the sheriff." Jamal stepped backward, stumbling slightly against the edge of a heavy dining chair. His mouth opened and closed silently, but he possessed no defense against empirical municipal data. He looked desperately toward Richard for a financial bailout, but my father was staring blankly at the floor, absolutely defeated. I was not done. I turned my attention away from the crumbling fake tech mogul and locked my eyes back onto my father. Richard looked up at me, his eyes pleading for a shred of mercy, begging me silently to halt the relentless barrage before there was absolutely nothing left of his dignity. I offered no mercy. He had shown me none when he handed me that fraudulent lease agreement in the coffee shop. I reached into the side pocket of my briefcase. I did not pull out another manila folder. I pulled out a crisp, sealed white envelope bearing the official embossed corporate logo of Grandpa Harrison's global logistics firm. "And Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced the entire room to lean in closer, just to hear the execution. "Grandpa Harrison asked me to give you this directly tonight." I slid the white envelope smoothly across the long dining table. It stopped mere inches from Richard's trembling hands. He stared at the envelope as if it were a highly volatile explosive device too terrified to even touch the heavy cardstock. "While you were busy trying to force me to co-sign a $500,000 home equity loan against my townhouse to save this foreclosing mansion," I explained coldly. Grandpa ordered an unannounced deep-level forensic audit of your entire regional division. He deployed external accountants to sweep your servers and review every single corporate credit card statement filed over the last 48 months. Richard let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table just to prevent his knees from giving out completely. Patricia let out a loud, horrified shriek, pressing both hands tightly against her mouth as the true scale of their absolute destruction fully materialized before her eyes. They found your ghost vendors, I revealed, exposing his final, most devastating secret to his elite country club friends. They tracked the fake invoices you generated for Phantom Logistics software upgrades. They traced the routing numbers directly to your personal credit union accounts. You have been actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from your own father's company to pay for Patricia's country club dues and Jamal's luxury vehicle leases. I gestured sharply to the pristine white envelope resting in front of his shaking fingers. That is a formal termination letter executed with absolute documented cause. You are officially fired for corporate embezzlement. You instantly forfeit all your unvested stock options. Your entire executive pension is completely nullified. Corporate security has already locked you out of the network server, and they will be clearing out your desk on Monday morning. You are walking away with absolutely nothing. The grand dining room, previously filled with the sounds of classical music and wealthy chatter, was now a silent graveyard of shattered illusions. The string quartet had completely stopped playing their instruments. The hired caterers stood frozen like statues against the walls. My parents were utterly dismantled, stripped of their wealth, their reputation, and their freedom in front of everyone they had spent decades trying to impress. But the final lethal move of my hostile takeover had yet to be played. I looked at the sobbing, panicking ruins of my toxic family, preparing to drop the third and final folder that would transfer the absolute ownership of their reality directly into my hands. The heavy silence holding the room hostage finally shattered, replaced by a chaotic symphony of pure, unfiltered panic. Brittany dropped her smartphone. The device hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, but the camera kept rolling, continuing to broadcast her total social annihilation to thousands of captive followers. She grabbed the velvet lapels of Jamal's tuxedo, her perfect manicured nails digging violently into the fabric. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as tears completely ruined her professional contouring. "Tell me she is lying, Jamal." Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Tell me you have the angel investor funding. Tell me you have the money to pay the mortgage. Tell me we are not losing this house." Jamal did not look at his wife. He did not offer any words of comfort or attempt to spin another fraudulent business metric. The arrogant, smooth-talking entrepreneur had completely evaporated. He stared blankly at the massive ice sculpture melting in the center of the table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. His silence was the loudest, most devastating confession he could possibly offer. Brittany collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably, mourning the immediate death of her manufactured high-society influencer persona. All around the grand dining room, the wealthy guests were no longer trying to hide their morbid fascination. The affluent neighborhood wives, the corporate executives, and the country club elite had their smartphones raised unabashedly, recording every single second of the spectacular implosion. They were capturing the exact moment the golden family of the suburbs was exposed as nothing more than broke, desperate thieves. My parents' entire carefully curated reputation was bleeding out onto the hardwood floor, broadcast live to the exact social circle they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. Patricia could not handle the exposure. The narcissistic need to maintain control and project superiority completely overtook whatever rational survival instincts she had left. She stepped over the shattered remains of her crystal wine glass, marching toward me with her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her glittering evening gown swished aggressively around her ankles. She stopped mere inches from where I stood, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged fury. "You ungrateful wretch!" Patricia screamed, the shrill pitch of her voice echoing painfully off the high ceilings. "How dare you? After everything we have sacrificed for you, You have no right to come into our home and do this to your own family. You are completely deranged. I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch at her volume. I looked at the woman who had spent 34 years treating me like a worthless, invisible burden. I looked at the woman who had happily forged federal documents to extort her own child just to fund my sister's designer handbag collection. I reached into my designer briefcase for the absolute last time. I pulled out the third and final folder. This one was entirely black heavy with the weight of absolute, undeniable financial authority. I held it up, making sure Patricia's furious eyes tracked the movement perfectly before I slid it slowly across the polished wood of the dining table. It stopped right next to the undeniable proof of her federal wire fraud. I did not come into your home. Mom, I stated, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm absolute zero. I came into mine. Patricia froze. The angry flush drained instantly from her face, replaced by a hollow, sickly gray. She stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake. I opened the black cover, revealing the heavily stamped and certified assignment of mortgage documents prepared by my elite estate attorney just 48 hours ago. The corporate seals of the commercial bank were clearly visible next to the registration details of Apex Holdings. When you and Dad defaulted on this predatory mortgage 90 days ago, the bank issued a formal notice of default. I explained with flawless clinical precision. You had a strict 14-day cure period before the sheriff initiated a public auction. You desperately needed me to sign that fake lease today to secure a $500,000 home equity loan against my townhouse to save this estate. But because my lawyer quietly froze my deed yesterday morning, your loan application was completely blocked. You were entirely out of options. I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between us, ensuring she felt the absolute crushing weight of my financial superiority. So I took my liquid offshore capital, and I formed a highly secure anonymous corporate entity. I continued, watching her eyes widen in sheer horror. I went directly to your commercial lender yesterday afternoon. I bought the distressed debt on this property in hard cash. I purchased your toxic, non-performing mortgage outright. I tapped the pristine eviction notice resting on top of the legal pile. I am your bank. I am your landlord. I hold the absolute legal right to your default. And because your mandatory 14-day grace period officially expired at noon today, I am executing a total immediate foreclosure. Patricia swayed on her feet, her hand flying to her chest. Richard let out a low, agonizing groan from the other end of the table, realizing that not only had he lost his job and his pension, but he had just lost his entire massive suburban estate to the daughter he had spent decades treating like garbage. You have exactly 14 days to vacate my property, I announced to the entire room, sealing their absolute destruction. You will pack your things and you will leave the keys on the counter. If you are not completely gone by the first of the month, the sheriff will arrive to physically execute the eviction order, and he will throw every single one of your designer bags directly onto the snow-covered lawn. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, final silence of a checkmate. There were no more lies to spin. There were no more gaslighting tactics to deploy. There was no more stolen capital to hide behind. I had systematically dismantled their entire manufactured reality, exposing the federal fraud, stripping the corporate titles, and legally purchasing the very ground beneath their feet. They thought I was just the quiet, overlooked middle child. They mistook my boundaries for weakness. They assumed my plain clothes meant I was struggling. They had absolutely no idea they were trying to extort a highly skilled cybersecurity architect who possessed the technical capability to track every stolen dollar and the immense financial capital required to buy their entire existence in cash. I looked at the weeping, shattered remains of the family that had tried to destroy me for 34 years. I felt no guilt. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the pure, exhilarating rush of absolute, untouchable freedom. I snapped the clasps of my designer briefcase shut, the sharp metallic click echoing with finality. I turned on my heel, the sound of my sensible shoes striking the imported hardwood floor with absolute finality. The crowd of affluent guests instinctively parted for me, creating a wide, silent path straight toward the grand double doors of the foyer. Behind me, the paralyzed shock of the room finally shattered, giving way to the frantic, humiliating sounds of pure, unfiltered desperation. "Maddie, wait!" Jamal's voice cracked, echoing off the high ceilings. The velvet tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume draped over a completely broken man. He scrambled past the melting ice sculpture, practically tripping over his own expensive leather shoes to chase after me. "Madison, please. We can work this out. I have 3 kids upstairs. You cannot just throw your own nieces out into the freezing snow. I will get a real job. I will shut down the startup. I will pay you back every single cent. Just give me a small extension. Give me 30 days." I paused at the threshold of the dining room, turning my head just enough to look at him over my shoulder. "You had 5 years to get a real job, Jamal. Instead, you chose to extort a woman you thought was weak and defenseless. My eviction notice does not negotiate. You have exactly 14 days. Brittany was hyperventilating near the fireplace, clutching the edge of the dining table as if it were a life raft on a rapidly sinking ship. The live stream on her dropped smartphone was still running, capturing every pathetic gasp for air and broadcasting her ultimate social demise. Her influencer empire was entirely dead, suffocated by the very reality she had tried so incredibly hard to hide from the world. She spent her days aggressively deleting hateful comments from her remaining social media accounts, but the internet never forgets a fraud. Patricia broke away from my catatonic father and lunged toward the foyer. The glittering evening gown dragged heavily behind her, snagging on the expensive rug. "Madison, please," she shrieked, the pristine socialite mask entirely gone, replaced by raw, primal terror. She reached out desperately, attempting to grab the sleeve of my coat, but I stepped smoothly out of her reach. "You cannot let your lawyer press felony charges. I am your mother. I will go to federal prison. We will lose absolutely everything. We will sell the cars right now. I will sell my jewelry. We will pay you back the stolen rent money. Just pick up your phone, call your lawyer, and call off the hounds. I am begging you." I looked at the woman who had spent 34 years treating me like a worthless, invisible disappointment. I maintained perfect, icy eye contact. "You are not going to federal prison because of me, Mom. You are going to prison because you systematically committed federal wire fraud to fund a pathetic lie. You made your choices. You signed the documents. Now you get to experience the absolute consequences." I pushed open the massive front doors and stepped out into the crisp, freezing winter air. The brutal cold hit my face like a refreshing shock to the system, clearing away the last lingering traces of their toxic environment. I did not look back. I did not offer a single ounce of comfort or a shred of forgiveness. I walked down the snow-covered driveway, handed my valet ticket to the stunned attendant, and climbed into my car. As I drove away from the $1.5 million estate I now legally owned, I felt an overwhelming, absolute peace. The war was officially over, and I had achieved total victory. The fallout over the next few months was swift, brutal, and entirely public. By the second week of January, the federal authorities officially indicted Richard and Patricia for multiple counts of wire and mail fraud. The evidence I had systematically collected, combined with the fraudulent lease agreement they had so eagerly signed at the coffee shop, left them with absolutely no legal defense. The local news outlets picked up the story of the disgraced logistics executive embezzling funds, turning their private humiliation into a headline spectacle. They desperately tried to hire elite defense attorneys, but without Grandpa Harrison's corporate allowance or my stolen rent money, they were completely bankrupt. They were forced to liquidate every single asset they possessed just to afford a basic legal retainer. Their exclusive country club memberships were instantly revoked. Their affluent friends completely abandoned them, treating them like highly contagious pariahs. Exactly 14 days after the Christmas Eve party, the county sheriff arrived at the suburban mansion. Brittany and Jamal were physically escorted off the property, their designer luggage stacked haphazardly on the frozen lawn. The moment the financial pipeline officially ran dry, Jamal's fierce dedication to his family instantly evaporated. Less than 3 weeks after the eviction, he completely abandoned Brittany and the kids fleeing to another state to avoid his mounting creditors and the reality of wage labor. Brittany was forced to move into a cramped, low-income apartment complex. As the primary lien holder, I took full legal possession of the suburban mansion. I had absolutely no desire to keep it. I hired an aggressive commercial real estate agency, staged the property beautifully, and sold it to a wealthy technology executive moving from California. The sale completely recovered the $1.2 million I had spent to purchase the distressed debt, plus a substantial profit from the remaining equity. I also successfully recovered the $270,000 in stolen rent through the strict criminal restitution orders placed against my parents during their sentencing. I took my fully restored capital and purchased a stunning, highly secure penthouse in the center of the city. I furnished the space exactly how I wanted, devoid of any pretentious clutter, prioritizing clean lines and functional elegance. It featured private elevator access, round-the-clock security, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire skyline. I continued working as a cybersecurity architect, protecting massive corporate networks and growing my wealth in absolute untouchable peace. The only family member I maintained contact with was Grandpa Harrison. We had lunch together every Sunday, sharing quiet conversations and a mutual unspoken respect for boundaries and truth. I had successfully excised the toxic infection from my life, replacing the constant anxiety of their expectations with the pristine, unshakable foundation of my own absolute independence. Sometimes the family you were born into is just a lesson in who you never want to become. Have you ever discovered a massive secret your family was hiding to use you? Share your story in the comments below. The chilling narrative of Madison and her triumph over financial extortion teaches a profound and necessary lesson. True empowerment comes from mastering emotional restraint and establishing absolute ironclad boundaries. Society frequently conditions us to believe that familial loyalty is an unbreakable pact, demanding endless forgiveness, even when that loyalty requires our own self-destruction. This journey effectively shatters this dangerous illusion, demonstrating that our worth is never defined by toxic relatives who view us merely as disposable resources. When confronted with blatant manipulation, narcissism, and financial theft, the natural human instinct is to scream fiercely, defend oneself, and desperately demand justice. However, this story brilliantly illustrates that emotional outbursts only provide manipulators with the exact leverage they seek. By choosing absolute silence and treating a deeply personal betrayal as a clinical, calculated threat, the protagonist instantly neutralized her family and their primary weapon. She did not beg for the maternal love she was continually denied. Instead, she quietly gathered the evidence. Her calculated, quiet restraint allowed her to construct an inescapable trap, proving that the calmest, quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the power. Ultimately, the core takeaway is that you are never obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic relatives warm. Bloodlines do not excuse systemic abuse, and biological ties are never a free pass for ongoing exploitation. Establishing unyielding boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-love and survival. We must learn to evaluate our relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than unearned entitlement. Take a moment today to audit your own relationships and dare to boldly cut ties with anyone who drains your peace to fuel their pride.